Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. Here, we tell real stories, quietly, calmly, and with care. If you're settling in for the night, we invite you to like, subscribe, and comment where in the world you're listening from. Thank you for spending this time with us. Now, let's begin. In the quiet town of Boonville, North Carolina, the days are slow and the nights are slower still. The Yadkin River winds lazily along the edge of town, and the same families have lived along its banks for generations. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and neighbors wave to one another from porch swings. In the early summer of 2000, something happened that would fracture that stillness, subtly at first, then all at once. On the evening of June 16th, 23-year-old Michelle Whitaker sat on the front steps of her mother's small white house at the end of an unpaved road. It was warm that night, and the stars were just beginning to emerge. Michelle had returned to Boonville just a few months prior, after a brief, difficult stint living in Tennessee with a boyfriend. The relationship had ended badly, though Michelle, soft-spoken and private, never shared many details. She simply packed her bags, caught a ride home, and moved back in with her mother Judy. Michelle had always been the quiet one in the family. The fifth of 6 children, she was the kind who lingered in corners during family gatherings and preferred long walks alone to crowded spaces. But she was thoughtful, deeply kind. She loved to read, especially poetry, and she kept old spiral notebooks filled with fragments of verses she never shared aloud. That night, her mother remembered Michelle had seemed a little off, restless maybe. She'd mentioned needing to get away for a bit, to think, to clear her head. Judy assumed it meant a walk, or maybe a drive to Elkin to stay with a friend. Michelle left just before 9 p.m., wearing jeans and a grey hoodie, her hair tied back. She didn't say where she was going. She never came back. At first there wasn't panic. Michelle was known to drift a little. She had a history of leaving for a few days to visit friends or spend time alone. Her family thought she just needed some space. But after 2 days with no phone call, Judy began to worry. By day 4, she contacted the Yadkin County Sheriff's Office to file a missing persons report. The response was muted. There was no immediate indication of foul play. Michelle was an adult, no signs of struggle, and according to the responding officer, she had a history of disappearing temporarily. The case was noted but not pursued aggressively. That small delay would come to haunt the Whitaker family for years. Days turned into weeks. Judy called every friend she could think of. Michelle didn't own a car, so someone must have picked her up, but no one claimed to have seen her that night. Her old boyfriend in Tennessee hadn't heard from her. Her social security number went unused. Her bank account remained untouched. Eventually, flyers were printed. Michelle's photo, shoulder-length auburn hair, soft green eyes, was posted across convenience stores and telephone poles. Volunteers combed nearby woods. Divers searched the riverbank, though there was no specific reason to suspect she was there. But Michelle had vanished as though into air. Over the years, tips came and went. She was spotted working as a waitress in Virginia. She was seen boarding a Greyhound bus in Asheville. Someone claimed she was living under a new name in West Virginia. None of the leads panned out. What complicated the search was Michelle's pattern. She had a history of drifting, short absences, mostly, but enough to give authorities an excuse to deprioritize her case. She'll come back, people said. She always does, but this time she didn't. Her family refused to give up. Judy Whitaker became a kind of quiet storm. She started a website. She called every agency she could think of. Every few months she drove to Raleigh to speak with state investigators, hoping someone would listen long enough to remember Michelle's name. One of Michelle's sisters, Lisa, began attending missing persons conferences. She spoke to rooms filled with parents and siblings who carried the same hollow ache. She brought with her a photo album, each page covered in little notes Michelle had written in her teen years. It was a way to make her sister real to strangers who only saw her as a case number. For 7 years the family waited. In 2007, the National Center for Missing Adults listed Michelle as presumed dead, a quiet formality. One more bureaucratic step toward the finality the family still refused to accept. But then on a Tuesday in September, a miracle happened. Judy received a phone call from a police department in Oregon. Michelle had been found, alive. It seemed impossible, but it was true. She had been living under a different name for nearly 7 years, working as a waitress in a small town outside Portland. She had no criminal record, no drugs in her system, no history of hospitalization. She had simply started over. When investigators asked why she had never reached out, she hesitated. She said she didn't think anyone wanted her back. She believed she'd burned too many bridges, that her family had given up on her. She said the last years before she left had been chaotic, full of conflict and misunderstanding. Her boyfriend in Tennessee had been abusive. She'd felt trapped. She left not only him, but the identity that tied her to all of it. She changed her name, dyed her hair, and started anew. Back in Boonville, the news was almost too much to process. Judy flew out immediately. Their reunion was quiet, private. Michelle apologized again and again. Judy only cried. But the truth was more complicated than relief. Michelle wasn't a missing person in the traditional sense. She had left on her own. But the context, the trauma, the isolation, the mental health struggles was profound. She hadn't been kidnapped. But she had in many ways been lost. When the media caught wind of the story, they painted her return as a miracle. The headlines read like fiction: missing for 7 years, found alive. But for the Whitakers, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a story of heartbreak, misunderstanding, and slow repair. Michelle didn't return to Boonville. She remained in Oregon, though she visited North Carolina occasionally. Her relationship with her siblings remained strained. Lisa, especially, found it difficult to reconcile years of mourning with the complicated reality of her sister's return. But they tried. Slowly, carefully. Michelle enrolled in counseling. She eventually agreed to give a statement to the North Carolina authorities, explaining her reasons for leaving. The missing persons case was closed. Her name was removed from databases. And yet for those who knew her, she never fully came back. She was quieter, still more reserved, a little watchful, even among family, as if part of her still didn't believe she was safe. For Boonville the story lingered. The town that had once whispered about tragedy, now struggled to process a stranger ending, the kind where someone survives, but the wound remains. In the years that followed, Michelle became an advocate for other missing women, especially those who'd left due to abuse, fear, or untreated trauma. She told her story not to excuse what she'd done, but to shed light on the invisible pain that pushes people to disappear. Her notebooks, once full of poetry, became full of letters. Most were unsent, but one she gave to her mother read, "I wasn't trying to leave you. I was trying to leave the noise in my head. I didn't think anyone could understand. And when I saw you searching for me, I thought I didn't deserve to be found. But you kept looking, and that saved me." The quiet return of Michelle Whitaker to the world she had left behind might have ended the legal mystery surrounding her disappearance, but it opened a far more complex emotional chapter in the lives of her family. For 7 years, they had mourned her absence, not knowing whether she was dead or alive, in pain or at peace. They had carried grief like a second skin. Now with Michelle alive, the relief came tangled with confusion, guilt, and a strange sense of distance. When Michelle stepped off the plane in North Carolina, she was thinner than Judy remembered, with shorter hair and eyes that carried something unreadable, neither sorrow nor joy, just caution. They hugged awkwardly at first, then longer. It took time for Michelle to speak more than a few words at a time. Her voice had changed, not in tone, but in pace. She spoke slowly, carefully, like someone relearning trust. At Judy's house nothing had changed. Michelle's old bedroom had been left almost untouched. Photos still on the walls, a dresser drawer full of letters Lisa had written to her after she vanished. Michelle stood in the doorway for a long time, her arms crossed, staring at the bed. Eventually she sat down and wept. But her return wasn't permanent. She stayed just 4 days in Boonville. Too many stares, too many whispers. Everyone wanted to know where she'd been, why she'd left, whether she understood what her family had been through. Michelle didn't offer answers, not in public. She wasn't sure she had any that would be satisfying. She returned to Oregon and quietly resumed her life. She worked 2 jobs, waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night. She rented a modest apartment in a 3-story walk-up, and told her neighbors little about her past. Most didn't ask, but what she carried inside never left her. In therapy, Michelle began to speak more openly about the final months before she left North Carolina. She described feeling cornered, emotionally and physically. Her relationship with her boyfriend in Tennessee had turned dark. There were long silences, followed by explosive arguments, and finally one night, violence. She'd fled in the middle of the night and walked 4 miles to a gas station, where she called a friend to pick her up. What she didn't do was tell her family. She couldn't. She had felt too ashamed, too defeated, too convinced that she had somehow brought it upon herself. That belief, so deeply ingrained, shaped every decision that followed. Michelle said she began to feel invisible. Even when she returned to Boonville, something inside her had gone hollow. She felt like a burden. She believed she had failed her family. And so on that quiet June night, when she walked away from her mother's house, she wasn't planning a new life. She was just trying to disappear. A stranger gave her a ride to Charlotte. She slept in bus stations, panhandled just enough for food. Eventually she caught a Greyhound to Atlanta, then Birmingham, then Memphis. In each city, she was just another nameless face, and in that anonymity, she found something that resembled peace. But Oregon felt different. It was in a small diner just outside Eugene, where she landed a job as a dishwasher. The manager didn't ask questions. She paid in cash, and Michelle worked 7 days a week without complaint. After 6 months, she was promoted to a server position. The staff grew fond of her quiet work ethic, her tendency to stay late and clean even when no one asked. Over the next 6 years, Michelle created a life that was simple, routine, and devoid of anything resembling intimacy. She avoided friendships. She never dated. She kept a small journal, but unlike the poetry she once wrote in Boonville, these entries were practical, lists, reminders, fragments of thoughts that rarely made sense to anyone but her. When the police finally identified her, through a routine background check during a minor car accident, she didn't resist. She gave them her real name without protest. In some ways it felt like relief. The hiding was over. Back in North Carolina, the Whitaker family wrestled with the truth. Judy struggled most with the years she had spent picturing her daughter's death. The empty seat at the holiday table, the birthdays celebrated in absence. She had grown older, her hair grayer, her eyes more tired. And now with Michelle alive, she felt as though time had folded in on itself. Lisa, on the other hand, felt betrayed. Not because Michelle had left, but because she hadn't reached out. She couldn't understand how her sister had allowed them to suffer so deeply. The thought of all the tears, the late-night prayers, the futile searches, it burned. The family entered counseling, and at Michelle's urging, the sessions were kept private. During one such session, Michelle finally spoke the words that had weighed on her since her return. "I didn't think I mattered," she said, voice trembling. "I thought you were all better off without me. That I was the disappointment no one talked about." Lisa said nothing for a long time. Then she whispered, "We talked about you every day." Rebuilding trust was not a matter of days or weeks. It took years. Even as Michelle and Judy began exchanging weekly phone calls, and Lisa visited Oregon twice, there remained a space between them, a space shaped not by anger, but by wounds too deep for simple apologies. Michelle never sought publicity. She turned down interviews. The one time a reporter managed to contact her, she asked them not to write her story. "I don't want to be a headline," she said, "I just want to be a person again." Instead she focused on healing. She returned to poetry. Slowly, tentatively. She filled 2 notebooks in her first year back, verses about mountains and rivers, about silence and distance, about the ache of being seen again after years of choosing to be invisible. In one poem, she wrote, "They searched for me, with flashlights and prayers, but I was somewhere inside my own shadow." She also began volunteering at a local women's shelter, quietly sharing her story with those who had left abusive homes or lives that no longer felt survivable. Her presence was gentle, never dramatic, just a reminder that sometimes the path back is long and uneven, but still possible. In Boonville, people moved on. New families came, new stories took root. But those who had known the Whitakers never forgot. And now when people spoke of Michelle, they didn't use the word missing. They used words like survivor, fighter, human. Michelle's story defied easy endings. She was not a victim in the traditional sense, and yet she had suffered greatly. Her disappearance had left wounds in her family and community. Her return, though miraculous, required just as much reckoning. But the beauty of her story, perhaps, was that it continued. Michelle didn't return to who she once was. She became someone new, formed not in spite of her disappearance, but through it. And in doing so, she gave those who knew her a new way to understand grief, and the fragile, imperfect nature of hope. The air in Eugene turned colder that November. Though Michelle didn't seem to mind the chill, she still walked to work most days, even when her breath hung in clouds, and the sidewalks were glazed with frost. Routine became a kind of salvation. Early mornings at the cafe, hours spent wiping down tables and refilling coffee cups, brief polite exchanges with customers, followed by quiet evenings, reading or writing or simply sitting at the small window in her apartment, watching headlights cross the walls. For the first time in years, she found comfort in stillness, and yet there was an ache that came with it, an ache that settled deep in the chest and whispered of what had been lost. Michelle had learned slowly to live in her body again. The woman she saw in the mirror was not the same one who had left Boonville all those years ago. There were faint lines around her eyes, a weariness in the way she held her shoulders. But there was also clarity. She no longer flinched when someone raised their voice nearby. She no longer looked over her shoulder at every intersection. Still the past lingered, not as a haunting, but as a presence, a shadow that followed quietly, never demanding attention but never gone. In her journal, Michelle wrote about the many versions of herself she had become since 2002. The runaway, the survivor, the stranger, the waitress, the sister. She imagined them sitting together in a room, not speaking, just watching each other. Not one of them the whole truth, but together perhaps something close. Judy called every Sunday. Their conversations remained gentle, rarely straying into deep waters. Judy asked about work, about the weather, about whether Michelle had remembered to buy a new coat before winter fully set in. Michelle always promised she had, even when she hadn't. There was still a fragility between them, like glass stretched too thin. But one evening, as Michelle stood at her stove boiling water for tea, she told Judy about the poetry reading she'd been invited to participate in. It was a small thing, just a dozen people at a used bookstore downtown, but it felt monumental. Judy listened in silence, then asked softly, "Will you read something about before?" Michelle paused. "Maybe. I think I need to." That same week Lisa sent a letter, an actual letter, written in ink and sealed with care. Inside were 4 pages filled with memories from their childhood, shared rooms, late-night whispers, the time they built a fort in the woods behind their house, and got caught in the rain.
Lisa wrote of missing those moments, of grieving both Michelle's absence and her return, of trying to understand how to love someone whose pain had made them unknowable for so long. At the bottom of the last page, she wrote, "I don't want the old you back, I just want you, however that looks now." Michelle read it 3 times. Then she cried for the first time in months. The poetry reading was held on a Thursday evening. The room smelled of old pages and cinnamon tea. Michelle wore a sweater Judy had knitted years ago, olive green, slightly frayed at the cuffs. When her name was called, she walked to the front and unfolded a paper with trembling hands. Her poem was called "Absent." I was a photograph in someone's drawer. A name said under breath. I was the pause before the prayer, the silence after death, but I lived in cracked motel beds and cafes no one knew. I folded into shadows until I couldn't see through. Then one day I remembered a laugh, a hand, a song, and though I wasn't ready, I knew I'd been gone too long. So I came back without answers, with nothing wrapped in gold. But I came back, still breathing, a story yet untold. When she finished, the room was still. Then someone began to clap, gently at first, then stronger. Not out of spectacle, but out of respect. Michelle sat down and took a breath that felt different from the ones before. Back in North Carolina, the Whitaker home changed too. Lisa had moved into a small apartment of her own and had started teaching art therapy classes at the community center. Her students ranged from teenagers navigating identity to older adults carrying decades of silent pain. Lisa found solace in helping others find expression. It reminded her of Michelle, before the disappearance, before the silence. She often brought her sister's poems to class, reading them aloud as anonymous works. They resonated. Judy, meanwhile, had returned to gardening. The flower beds had gone untended for years during Michelle's absence, but now the soil seemed softer, more willing to grow again. She planted wildflowers and lilies, the same kind Michelle used to pick as a child, and press between books. Some days she would sit outside with a cup of coffee, and reread the letters she and Michelle now exchanged. Some were short and practical, others were winding and reflective. She kept them all in a wooden box, labeled simply, Michelle's disappearance, and her unexpected re-emergence, had brought attention the family never wanted. Though most of the media frenzy died down within weeks, online forums and amateur true crime enthusiasts continued to speculate. Some questioned her story, others criticized her for running away or abandoning her family. Michelle never responded publicly. She understood that people craved closure, explanations, clean narratives with heroes and villains. But her story was none of those things. It was messy, it was human, and she would not apologize for having survived. One evening, Michelle attended a support group for missing persons who had returned. The room was small, housed in a community center basement. There were 8 people there, men and women of varying ages, each carrying a story no one else quite understood. They talked about the years they lost, the ways their families either welcomed them or couldn't quite look them in the eye, the grief of coming back to a life that had gone on without them. Michelle listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words were steady. I left because I thought I didn't matter. I came back because I realized I did. Not just to them, but to me. Another woman nodded and whispered, "That's the hardest part." Over time, Michelle began to write again with greater purpose. She compiled her poems, essays and fragments into a manuscript. A small independent press in Portland accepted it. The book was called The Stillness Between. She didn't promote it widely, but she sent the first copy to Judy. Inside she wrote, "For the years we lost, for the ones we have left, the healing was slow, non-linear, and unfinished." Some days Michelle still felt the urge to disappear, not to run, but to retreat into the safety of solitude. But she no longer believed she had to go away to be okay. Her life was not dramatic. It was quiet, composed of early mornings, handwritten notes, long walks, and small moments of connection. But in that quiet there was meaning. There was breath. There was presence. And for Michelle, presence was everything. In the winter of the following year, the trees in Eugene stood bare, skeletal outlines against a sky the color of slate. Snow rarely lingered long in the city, but when it did, the streets grew hushed and softened, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Michelle had lived in her apartment for over 3 years now. The rhythm of her days was predictable. She worked at the cafe 4 days a week, spent weekends writing, and reserved her evenings for long meditative walks. She knew her neighbors, recognized familiar faces at the grocery store, and had grown accustomed to the muted tones of the Pacific Northwest. For the first time in her adult life, Michelle felt what she could only describe as grounded. But memory, she had learned, never leaves for good. That January, Michelle received an unexpected letter from someone she hadn't spoken to since high school. It was from Erica Larson, her best friend from freshman year, the one she used to stay up late talking with, sharing dreams of leaving Boonville for bigger things. They had drifted apart in senior year, and Michelle had thought of her only in fragments, an old photo, a song on the radio. Erica's handwriting was nearly the same. She had seen Michelle's book in a Portland bookstore, recognized the name and picked it up on impulse. "I read it in one night," she wrote. "I cried. I didn't know what happened to you, but I always wondered." The letter was thoughtful, not probing. Erica didn't demand details. Instead, she offered something that Michelle hadn't expected: recognition. "You don't owe the world an explanation," she wrote. "But I just want you to know, back then you were already enough." Michelle folded the letter carefully, and placed it in a drawer, with the others that mattered. There were still so many letters she didn't respond to. People from Boonville, reporters, distant relatives, strangers who claimed to understand her story. Some letters were cruel, others kind, but all demanded something: answers, explanations, peace. She responded to only a few. One she returned to several times was from a woman named Laurel James, who had gone missing for 8 months in 1999, before being found alive in Colorado. Laurel's story had been plastered across tabloids at the time. Her letter, dated and typed on a typewriter, said simply, "We are not puzzles to be solved. We are pages still being written. Let them guess. We know what we survived." Michelle didn't know if she would ever meet Laurel, but the letter stayed on her fridge for months. Back in North Carolina, the quiet healing continued. Lisa visited Judy every Thursday night, and together they would cook dinner and watch reruns of old detective shows, occasionally offering commentary that bordered on absurd. "That suspect's definitely lying," Lisa would say. Too much eye contact. They rarely spoke about Michelle now, not out of discomfort, but out of peace. She had returned. She was alive. That was enough. Sometimes Judy would show Lisa a new letter from Michelle, or a copy of a recent poem she'd published in a small literary magazine. They would read them aloud, the words settling in the space between them like soft rain. Michelle's book, The Stillness Between, had gathered quiet praise in literary circles. Critics described it as spare but devastating, an unflinching portrait of the after. She never did television interviews. She declined offers to adapt the book for film. "Some things should stay on the page," she wrote in response to one producer. Instead, Michelle began speaking occasionally at universities, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, always under the understanding that she would not discuss the details of her disappearance. She spoke about trauma, silence, and the resilience of returning. In one seminar, a student asked, "Do you think you ever really came back?" Michelle paused before answering. "I don't think back is the right direction," she said. I think I moved forward, with the weight of what happened, but also with the will to keep going. There was silence in the room after that, the kind that came not from awkwardness, but from recognition. At one of those talks, she met Dr. Avery Shaw, a trauma psychologist, who had written extensively on reintegration after disappearance. He was in his early 50s, thoughtful and unassuming. They talked for hours after the lecture about memory, about why the brain chooses silence, and about the quiet ways people try to live again. Their connection was not romantic, not exactly, but it was intimate in a different way. They became close, writing, visiting, sharing long conversations over herbal tea. Michelle often said that Avery understood her not because he wanted to fix her, but because he never tried to. Avery helped Michelle develop a new project, a writing group specifically for people who had disappeared and returned. Some of them were victims of abduction. These others had run away as teens. A few had simply left their lives behind one day, and only now were trying to explain why. The group met monthly, and Michelle often said little, simply holding space for others to speak. In one session, a woman named Marla said, "I don't remember who I was back then, and I'm afraid that who I am now isn't real either." Michelle looked at her and said quietly, "Both are real. You are the bridge between them." Outside the writing group, Michelle maintained her solitude. She still lived alone, still found herself walking in the early mornings, still kept her apartment filled with books and soft music. She adopted a grey cat with green eyes named Sybil, who had a habit of sitting on her keyboard while she tried to write. The cat seemed to understand silence too. One spring afternoon, Michelle received a call from Lisa. It wasn't urgent, just an invitation. "There's a reunion happening at the old high school in June," Lisa said. "I know it's probably the last place you want to be, but I thought you should know." Michelle didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, watching Sybil stalk a patch of sunlight. "I'll think about it," she said finally. In June she flew home. The reunion was held in the gymnasium, decorated with balloons and banners, and a photo slideshow projected on the wall. Most of the attendees were polite, a few emotional. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Michelle kept to the edges of the room, speaking only to those she remembered well. She found Erica there, standing by the punch table. They hugged without words. Weeks later, Michelle stepped outside to the edge of the school lawn. The air smelled like honeysuckle and memory. Lisa joined her. "You okay?" she asked. Michelle nodded. "It's strange. Might, but not bad." They stood in silence for a while. The stars began to prick through the dusky sky. Lisa said, "You know, when you were gone, I used to look up at the night sky and think, somewhere under this, she's alive." I didn't even know if I believed it, but I said it anyway. Michelle looked at her sister, then back at the sky. "I think I felt that," she said. "Somewhere."
Before returning to Oregon, Michelle visited the old house. It had been sold years ago, but she walked past it slowly, hands in her pockets, the memories surfacing like driftwood. The tree she used to climb was still there, the steps she used to sit on while reading, worn now, but intact. She didn't linger. Back in Eugene, Michelle returned to her quiet life. The world no longer demanded her story. Those who needed to know already did. She wrote still, taught workshops, sent letters. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by her window, the cat curled at her feet, and look at the stars. And sometimes she would whisper, for no one in particular, "I'm still here," because she was. The first snow in Calumet, Michigan, always seemed to arrive without warning. One morning, the sidewalks would be bare, the air dry and cool. By evening, the world outside would be cloaked in white, as if erased and rewritten in silence. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where stories lingered longer than people wanted to admit. In December 1990, a story began that would never quite leave the town. Her name was Karen Roston. She was 32 years old, with a face that neighbors often said reminded them of old photographs, sharp, expressive, carrying a kind of quiet strength. She lived in a small rented house on 6th Street, a narrow stretch lined with modest homes and old porches wrapped in icicles. Karen worked at the Calumet Historical Society, where she helped preserve mining records, archived letters, and led school tours about the ghost towns that dotted the Upper Peninsula. People who knew her called her steady, kind, private. She rarely attended community events, but she wasn't reclusive. She shopped at Louis' Market, said hello to her neighbors, walked her aging Labrador, Jasper, twice a day without fail. Hers was a quiet life, one built with care. Then, just days before Christmas, she vanished. The first person to notice was her landlord, Tom Berrigan, who lived 2 houses down. He hadn't seen her out with the dog in nearly 2 days. A package had been left on the porch and was buried under snow. Her car was still parked out front, windshield iced over, untouched. Berrigan knocked on her door that morning, then again in the afternoon. No answer. That evening, concerned, he called the police. The responding officer, Deputy Sloan, entered the house through the back door, which was unlocked. Inside, the air was still. Jasper was there, curled in his bed and clearly distressed, his water bowl empty. The kitchen lights were on. On the table, a mug of coffee had gone cold next to an open notebook filled with Karen's neat handwriting. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, nothing out of place. But Karen was gone. The case was assigned to Detective Ellen Pryor, who had worked for the Houghton County Sheriff's Office for nearly 2 decades. She wasn't quick to make assumptions. She took her time retracing Karen's last known movements with meticulous care. The last confirmed sighting of Karen was on the morning of December 18th, when she walked Jasper near the Calumet Theatre. A neighbor saw her from their kitchen window. She had waved. That evening, someone had heard her porch light switch on around 6 p.m. After that, silence. Karen's wallet, keys and purse were still in the house. Her winter boots were by the door, her coat missing, but none of her other clothes were disturbed. Her toothbrush was still damp. The television remote rested on the arm of the couch. It was as if she had stepped out into the cold and never returned. A search was organized. Volunteers from Calumet and nearby towns canvassed fields, woods, and abandoned mine shafts. Helicopters circled. Tracking dogs followed faint trails that disappeared into the snow near an old, unused rail line that ran behind her house. Detective Pryor followed every thread. She interviewed co-workers at the Historical Society. They said Karen had seemed quiet lately, but not unusual. She had been working on cataloging personal letters from a mining family that lived in the area in the early 1900s. She'd seemed particularly interested in one set of letters between a wife and her husband who'd gone missing in a mining collapse and was never found. When asked about the letters, Karen's co-worker, Teresa Mann, said, "She told me once it made her sad how people can disappear and just become a paragraph in a folder. I think she was starting to see herself in those stories." Karen's family lived in Wisconsin. Her younger sister, Danta, drove to Calumet as soon as she heard the news. She hadn't seen Karen in person for over a year, though they spoke every few weeks. Dana stayed in her sister's house during the early days of the search, unsure whether to cry or to keep busy. "I kept expecting her to come back," Dana later told reporters. "Like maybe she went to find something, or someone, but the dog was still there. She would never have left him." In the days that followed, strange details began to surface. A neighbor, Eleanor Driscoll, reported that a man in a dark coat had knocked on her door a few days before Karen vanished. He claimed he was looking for someone named Judith. She told him he had the wrong house, and he left but slowly, as if waiting for something. She described him as tall, late 40s, unshaven. Detective Pryor cross-referenced the description with known offenders in the region, but there were no matches. A composite sketch was created, distributed quietly, but no solid leads came from it. Then another oddity. In Karen's notebook, the one left on the kitchen table, Detective Pryor found a list of names. It appeared random at first, but with help from the Historical Society, she realized the names were all women who had lived in Calumet between 1900 and 1930. Several had been declared missing during that time, many never found. Was it just research for her work, or was Karen trying to draw a connection? One entry stood out: Amvar. Last seen near tramline. No recovery. Next to it Karen had written a single word: echoes. Detective Pryor considered the possibility that Karen had left voluntarily, that maybe she had chosen to disappear, inspired by the very stories she was so immersed in. But that theory didn't sit right. Karen had a stable life, a dog she adored, a house she kept in immaculate condition. Her sister insisted she would never vanish without at least saying something. Weeks turned into months. Snow melted. Spring arrived in quiet shades of green and grey. The case remained open, but the trail had gone cold. In May, a child walking near the abandoned rail line found something strange in a collapsed drainage tunnel, a scarf, partially frozen into the mud. It was Karen's. DNA confirmed it, but there was nothing else. No footprints, no remains, just the scarf. Detective Pryor visited the site herself. The tunnel was barely accessible, damp and half caved in. Standing there, she couldn't help but feel the stillness. Not the peace of nature, but the eerie, dense quiet of a place holding its breath. Karen's case joined the dozens of missing person files that sat, over time, in the corner of the sheriff's office. Not forgotten, but no longer urgent. A photograph on a bulletin board. A date circled in red. Calumet carried on. People spoke of Karen less as time passed, but in small ways she lingered. A framed photo in the Historical Society. A copy of her notes filed away in a labeled box. Her house, eventually rented again, but never quite the same. And always, that sense of something unresolved. A person who vanished not in chaos, but in silence. A story without an ending. A life that slipped through the cracks of memory and weather. Detective Pryor never closed the file. Not officially. By the time June settled into Calumet, the wind had turned warm and the days stretched into golden evenings. Children played in the streets again. The snow had fully melted, and storefronts reopened with the quiet optimism that came with summer. But the memory of Karen Roston's disappearance remained, like a low hum beneath daily life. It was not spoken about loudly anymore, just in fragments, glances, unfinished sentences. Detective Ellen Pryor sat at her desk, the pale morning light slanting across the stack of folders that had been reduced to routine cold case updates. Karen's file lay just beneath the latest vehicle theft report, but she hadn't stopped thinking about it. Some cases just settle into you like weather, constant, changing only in tone, never in presence. She found herself returning, again and again, to Karen's notebook, the list of names, the notes about disappearances from decades earlier, the phrase echoes, scrawled beside one of the entries. It wasn't typical work-related research. There was something deliberate in Karen's choices, her careful grouping of names, her emphasis on patterns. But what was she searching for? Ellen visited the Calumet Historical Society again in early July. It was a warm day, the kind where even the breeze felt soft. Inside the building, the air was cool and smelled faintly of old paper. Teresa Mann, Karen's co-worker, was on duty again. She wore a cardigan despite the heat and seemed tired, but her eyes brightened when Ellen entered. "I figured you might come back," Teresa said. "I've been thinking about her a lot lately. I dream about her sometimes. She's always walking into the woods." Ellen raised an eyebrow. "Walking into the woods?" Teresa nodded. "It's the same dream every time. She doesn't turn around. She just walks into the trees like she belongs there, like she's always been a part of them." They went into the back archives, where Karen had last worked. The desk was the same. Teresa hadn't allowed anyone else to use it. A mark of respect, or maybe of superstition. "I found something," Teresa said, pulling a small envelope from a drawer. It was wedged behind the bookshelf. Could have fallen there months ago. It's addressed to her. No return address. The envelope was yellowed and unsealed.
Inside was a postcard, an old black and white image of Calumet, from the early 1900s. On the back, written in blocky, uncertain handwriting, were just 5 words. "You're close. Don't stop now." Ellen felt a coldness settle under her skin. The postmark was blurred. No clear date, no legible stamp. But the message was recent. Karen had received it not long before she vanished. She kept staring at the handwriting. It was oddly deliberate, like someone trying not to reveal their natural style. Back at the station, Ellen reviewed Karen's phone records again. One call stood out, not for its frequency, but for its silence. On the evening of December 17th, at 10:21 p.m., Karen had called a number in Marquette. The call lasted 28 seconds. No one picked up, but the number belonged to a payphone outside an old gas station, long since closed. There was no follow-up call, no messages, just the single attempt. She drove out there herself, a 2-hour trip across pine-shadowed highways. The station was still there, boarded up and half swallowed by vines. The payphone had been removed, just a rusted bracket left behind. Why would Karen call a dead line? Across the street stood a diner, also old, barely functional, but still open. A bell rang when Ellen entered, and a woman in her 60s behind the counter gave her a long measuring look. "You a cop?" the woman asked. "Detective," Ellen answered, flashing her badge. "You're not the first." Ellen paused. "Not the first what?" "To ask about that phone. Or her." The woman poured herself coffee, and nodded toward a stool. "Sit. I'll tell you what I remember. Her name was Doris Algren, and she'd run the diner for over 30 years. She didn't miss much. Said a woman had come in around that time, mid-December, a few days before Christmas. Quiet. Dark coat. No gloves. Sat at the counter, and ordered tea. Didn't say much, but kept looking out the window at the gas station. Looked like she was waiting for someone," Doris said. When Ellen showed her a photo of Karen, the woman's eyes went soft. "That's her. I remember the eyes." Doris remembered that Karen had left abruptly, not even finishing her tea. She walked to the payphone, stood there for several minutes, then disappeared behind the gas station into the woods. Never came back. "I figured she met someone," Doris said. But no one ever followed. The story didn't make sense. Why drive 2 hours to a derelict town, place a call to a payphone, then vanish behind a closed station? Unless she was meeting someone who didn't want to be found. Back in Calumet, Ellen reviewed the other disappearances Karen had documented. A name kept recurring. M. Vera. Margaret Vera, age 26, disappeared in 1907. Last seen near the tram line that ran behind what was now Karen's house. The case had been considered a tragic loss, another young woman gone missing in the harsh winters of the Upper Peninsula. But there was something about Margaret's story that stood out. Before her disappearance, Margaret had reportedly spoken about a man who followed her. She had written in a letter to her sister, "He comes and goes, but always stands near the trees. I don't know how he finds me." The letter had been preserved in the Historical Society's records. Karen had copied it, underlined the passage twice. Ellen drove to the old tramline path the next morning. The rail ties were mostly rotted now, buried under moss and overgrowth. The same place where Karen's scarf had been found. The air smelled like wet earth, and the trees leaned in like they knew secrets. Halfway down the path, Ellen found something new, a length of twine tied to a tree branch, and beneath it, buried in the soil, a piece of cloth weathered, but clearly modern. Nearby, a rusted tin can held several slips of paper, protected by wax paper. She knelt and opened them one by one. They were notes, handwritten, all addressed to the one who listens. Some were half poems, others were just thoughts. One read, "Sometimes I feel her still here, just beyond the tree line, watching, listening. Maybe she was right. We don't vanish, we echo." Another simply said, "I thought if I followed her, I'd understand, but I only understand the silence now." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. These weren't Karen's notes. The handwriting was different, but someone had been coming here, leaving thoughts, watching the same place. She had the notes analyzed. They weren't recent. At least 2 were from the late 90s. One was dated 2003. Whoever had written them had come here again and again. Was this some kind of shared hallucination? A belief that the forest held answers? Or something darker? A connection between people who disappeared and those who went looking for them? The psychological profile was becoming more complicated. Karen hadn't just researched disappearances, she had internalized them. She saw herself in those women. Maybe she saw a message in their vanishing. Maybe she believed there was a pattern, something only she could follow. Or maybe she was lured by someone who used that belief to draw her in. Ellen returned to the diner, asked Doris if anyone else had come asking about Karen over the years. Doris hesitated. There was a man, she finally said. Came last summer. Said he was writing a book about missing women. Asked about Karen. Wrote things down in a little notebook. Did she remember his name? No. But he left a number. Said to call if I remembered anything else. She pulled out a scrap of paper from the cash register. The number was from Detroit. A landline. Ellen called it. Disconnected. She searched local publishing records. No books about missing women in Calumet had been released in the last 10 years. The man had lied. Back in Calumet, the air turned again. The first cool breeze of approaching fall. Ellen walked the old rail line every day now, retracing Karen's last steps. Sometimes she spoke aloud, hoping the silence might speak back. Karen had followed a trail of history, of mystery, of patterns carved deep into the past, and maybe someone had been watching her do it. Someone who still was. By late August, Calumet had begun to shift again. The warmth lingered during the day, but the nights cooled with warning. Shadows lengthened more quickly, the trees beginning to turn at the edges. Detective Ellen Pryor found herself drawn more deeply into the woods, both literally and figuratively. Something about Karen Roston's disappearance had changed shape in her mind. It was no longer just a case. It had become a quiet pursuit of something older, more elusive. She had the tin can and its contents, sent for forensic testing. The slips of paper, weathered but still legible, were examined for fingerprints. 2 prints came back partial, but usable. One belonged to Karen. The other had no match in any state or federal database. Ellen reread the notes late at night in her office, listening to the hum of the overhead lights. One of the messages, dated 2003, had troubled her in particular. I followed her once, but the forest gave her back. I fear if I try again, it won't do the same for me. Who had written that? It wasn't Karen. This was a full decade before her disappearance. Someone else had been watching, searching, and perhaps even seeing things no one else would believe. Ellen tracked down old property records near the woods behind Karen's home. A name surfaced again and again, the Ludlow Tract, a stretch of unincorporated land held in a family trust that hadn't been updated since 1975. No address, no phone number, just the name of a man long dead, Leonard Ludlow. She found a local man, retired county surveyor, who remembered the Ludlow land. No one lives there, he'd said. Never did, far as I know. Old family from way back. Weird folk. Used to come up from downstate every few years, then just stopped. Place is probably caved in now. The parcel was only a few miles from Karen's house. Off-grid. No road markers. No trailheads. Ellen went out the following morning, with a pair of boots, a flashlight, and a sense of quiet determination. It took her the better part of an hour, guided by a topo map, and a faint animal trail, but she found it a collapsed hunting shack, half swallowed by earth and moss. The roof had given way years ago. It stank of mildew and decay, but inside, sheltered beneath broken beams and rotted canvas, was a rusted file cabinet. And inside that cabinet was paper, stacks of notes, clippings, names. Some were handwritten, others typewritten on faded paper, the kind used by police in the 1970s. Dozens of missing persons cases, some known, others obscure. Most were women, all from rural towns across Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. A map was pinned to the side of the cabinet, torn and stained, but still intact. Thumbtacks marked locations. One of them, Calumet, another Marquette, and one in a place Ellen had never heard of, Obsidian Hollow. She photographed everything, took samples, but something about the scene disturbed her, not just the decay or the secrecy of it, but the order. Whoever had collected this information had been meticulous, almost reverent. Back at the station, Ellen traced Obsidian Hollow. It didn't appear on modern maps, but in archived mining documents, it showed up briefly. A small settlement, a mining camp that operated from 1894 to 1902, before being closed after a shaft collapse killed 9 workers. The town was abandoned shortly after. There were no photographs, no residents listed in census documents. It was as if the town had been quietly erased. Karen had underlined that name in one of her journals. At home that night, Ellen sat by her window, watching the treetops sway in the wind. She thought of Karen, of her long walks through the woods, her late nights with coffee and old records, her belief that echoes of the past were more than memories. Maybe Karen believed the people who vanished hadn't been taken, but had gone, followed something invisible to the rest of the world. That weekend, Ellen drove out to where Obsidian Hollow once stood. It was remote, an hour outside Calumet, then another 40 minutes down a barely drivable forest path. Her GPS lost signal, 20 minutes in. The road narrowed until it became little more than a footpath. She came upon what remained of the town by late afternoon, foundations mostly, crumbled bricks, a rusted horseshoe, the skeletal frame of a well, a sign hung on one nail, swaying in the breeze, faded letters that once said post office. There was no sound but the wind and her own footsteps. She stood in the silence, heart heavy. This was where people had lived, had eaten, had dreamed, and then had been forgotten. Ellen followed the terrain deeper, toward where the old mine had once been. The entrance was blocked by boulders and undergrowth, but a faint draft could still be felt if one stood close, cold and deep. Nearby, beneath a pile of old wood, Ellen found a set of stone steps, partially buried in dirt. She cleared them slowly, brushing away decades of leaves and dust. The stairs led down to a small sunken chamber, perhaps once a storage cellar, or holding room, and there, tucked against the back wall, was a satchel. It was moldy, the leather cracked, but intact. Inside were 3 items: a notebook, a hand mirror, and a scarf. Karen's scarf. Ellen knelt slowly, heart pounding. She opened the notebook. The handwriting was unmistakable. Karen's. The first page was dated December 10th, 2023, 4 days before she was last seen. If I am right, this is where it ends, or begins. I can feel them watching me. The ones who stayed, the ones who didn't leave footprints. If I don't come back, it's because I finally saw it. Not a person, not a place, something else, something I've always heard in the trees, calling me closer. The rest of the pages were filled with fragments, memories, dreams, strange notations, times and dates with no explanation. Some were scribbled so quickly, they were nearly illegible. Midnight, bells in the trees, not wind, music. The names repeat, same syllables. Vowera, Ruston, Elson, Marath. Is this a loop? I saw her, not in a dream, in the water. Margaret Vowera. Same eyes. Ellen sat with the notebook for a long time. Her breath came slow. She felt as though she were intruding on something not meant to be found. She took everything, returned to her car in silence. That evening, back at her desk, she laid the scarf gently on the table. The lab would confirm it was Karen's, but she already knew. She read the notebook again, page by page. On the final entry, dated the night before she vanished, Karen had written, "If I don't come back, don't try to find me. This isn't about being taken, it's about choosing. We disappear because we want to. We stay gone because something bigger calls us." Tell my sister I was never afraid. Alan closed the notebook. Her hands trembled. There was no sign of foul play, no blood, no broken trail, no proof that anyone else had been involved. Just a woman who followed a trail of echoes into the forest, and perhaps never intended to return. Still, it wasn't enough to close the case. Alan reviewed the collected evidence again. Every note, every document. One item stood out. A torn photograph tucked in the back of the Ludlow file cabinet. It showed two women in front of a cabin. One looked like Karen, the other, older, same eyes, same expression, but the photo had to be from the 1960s. She sent it for analysis. Waited. The lab results came back. The photo was authentic, undated, but chemically consistent with mid-20th century film. The woman resembling Karen could not be definitively identified. Alan returned to the tram line that week. Walked it again in the dusk. She stopped where the scarf had once been found, sat in the dirt, and listened. The wind passed through the trees like a whisper. The sun dropped behind the hills. In the growing darkness, she thought she heard something faint, like music, a soft chime, not metal, not mechanical. A moment later, it was gone. In the weeks following her visit to Obsidian Hollow, Detective Ellen Pryor found herself pulled in two directions. One was the traditional path of her work, analysis, reports, chain of evidence. The other was something she couldn't name, a sense not unlike what Karen Ruston had written about. That feeling that the air between the trees held stories, and not all of them were waiting to be solved. Karen's case remained officially open, but unofficially cold. Alan had found no trace of Karen's physical remains, no new witnesses, no confirmed sightings, yet she had the notebook, the scarf, the mirror, and the satchel, all hidden beneath an abandoned mining settlement, all weathered by time, but unmistakably real. The mirror intrigued her most. It was old beveled glass in a bronze frame, not valuable, but distinct. The initials MV were etched faintly in the corner of the backing. Alan initially thought it stood for Margaret Vara, the woman Karen had researched obsessively before her disappearance. But when she asked around, older residents offered a different story. The mirror had been part of a local folklore, used to belong to the Vara women. An elderly librarian told her one day, almost offhand. They said it reflected more than your face, showed what you wanted to see, or feared to see, depends on who you ask. A mirror like that was easy to dismiss, but in a town like Calumet, steeped in history, and held together by shared memory, even dismissed things could cast long shadows. Alan brought the mirror back to her home. She didn't place it on the wall or over a dresser. Instead, she set it in her den, leaning against the wall, angled just slightly toward the window. At night it reflected only moonlight. During the day, trees. She kept Karen's notebook close, reading passages during quiet evenings. One entry in particular refused to leave her. Time folds in the forest. Not linear. I saw her before she came. I saw myself watching her. Not a dream. A memory that hadn't happened yet. It read like poetry or madness. But after visiting Obsidian Hollow, Alan found herself believing, not in ghosts or time travel, necessarily, but in possibility, that not everything could be catalogued by reason. Then 3 weeks after the visit, a local teenager hiking near the mining trail found something, a woman's shoe, dirt-caked, the sole worn thin. He brought it to the sheriff's office, assuming it belonged to a hunter or camper. Alan recognized it instantly. It was the same brand and color Karen had been wearing when she disappeared, information that had never been released publicly. A search party was organized. They swept the area over 2 days, but found nothing else. Still, Alan returned alone the following week. She retraced the boy's path, walked until the branches opened above her, and the horizon bent slightly downward, an indentation in the forest floor that felt older than the trees around it. She didn't find Karen, but she found more notebooks, stuffed into a sealed mason jar, buried beneath a cluster of rocks near the base of a gnarled birch. There were 3 of them, moldy at the edges, pages brittle but intact. Dates scrawled on the covers. January 2024, February 2020 and March 2024. Karen had written them. There was no question. Her handwriting. Her voice. But she had disappeared in December 2023. Alan read them slowly, breath catching at every page. The entries weren't dated daily. They were sporadic. But their tone shifted. First fearful, then curious, then peaceful. I followed them deeper. I thought it would feel like dying. It didn't. Just changing clothes. The air's thinner, but I don't mind. I sleep beneath the roots now. The world hums differently here. They don't have names. Or if they do, they've forgotten them. I call them the hollow. They appear only when I stop looking for them. I think I've become one of them. In the March notebook, her writing slowed. Words became disjointed. Thoughts wandered. Time is a body. You can crawl inside it. Wear it like a skin. That's what they do. That's what I'm learning. And the final entry. Tell Ellen I'm not lost. Just elsewhere. I remember the tram line. I remember the snow. I remember watching myself leave. You never really vanish. You just change the way you're seen. Alan stared at the words for a long time. She had read hundreds of police reports, thousands of case files, statements filled with confusion, denial, pain, but never anything like this. She brought the notebooks in for testing. The paper was aged appropriately. No signs of forgery. The ink matched what Karen used in her journals. No fingerprints, except Karen's, and her own. There was no rational way Karen could have written them after she disappeared, and yet they existed. Her supervisor urged her to take a break. The case wasn't solvable, he said. They had exhausted all avenues. Perhaps it was time to let it be. But Ellen couldn't let it go. She began researching every person who had gone missing near the Upper Peninsula in the last century. Patterns emerged, not in names or demographics, but in locations. Many had vanished within a 30-mile radius of Obsidian Hollow, often without clear reason, often with signs they may have left intentionally. She found one curious case from 1954. A man named Julian Crane disappeared on a fishing trip. Weeks later, his wife received a letter. No postmark, no return address, just a single sentence. It's beautiful here. You wouldn't believe the stars. It was dismissed as a prank at the time, but the handwriting, when compared to Julian's past letters, was a perfect match.
Ellen began to wonder, what if they all went to the same place? What if Karen's disappearance wasn't a single incident, but part of something wider? Still, there was no way to prove it. Only suggestions. Echoes. That fall, the forest around Calumet turned again. The trees flared in oranges and reds. The wind blew colder. Hunters came and went. Snow threatened on the edges of the calendar. And then something happened that Ellen could never explain. She was walking her usual path, north of the tram line, near a bend in the creek, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. No one. She kept walking. The sound returned. Not footsteps, exactly more like a second echo, just out of rhythm with her own. At the edge of the path, she saw it, the mirror. Not hers. Not the one she'd brought home. This one was older, cracked down the middle, leaning against a tree stump like someone had placed it there intentionally. She picked it up. Her reflection wavered. And for a moment, only a moment, she saw someone standing behind her. Karen, smiling, not sad, not afraid. And then she was gone. Ellen stood there, heart still. The wind moved. A bird called from deep in the trees. The mirror in her hands was cold. That night, she locked it in her office drawer. Karen's case remains open to this day. There are no suspects, no evidence of abduction or foul play. Officially, it's listed as a missing persons file with unexplained circumstances. But for Ellen, and for those who've read Karen's words, the story isn't about evidence. It's about the space between. The hollows where silence lives. The margins of maps. The places we stop seeing when we grow too rational. Karen Roston may never return, but her voice, her journey, those remain. Somewhere out in the trees, perhaps just beyond the edge of sound, a young woman walks quietly through fallen leaves, following something only she can hear. On a winter morning in January 1992, the town of Westfield, Massachusetts, awoke to a stillness that felt deeper than the snowdrifts blanketing the sidewalks. It was a college town, quiet but not sleepy, home to artists, teachers, and the winding threads of families that had known each other for generations. In the early light, the streets were mostly empty except for the occasional hiss of a snowplow or the bundled-up figure of a student making their way toward campus. Just outside of town, nestled in the woods, sat a farmhouse that had belonged to the Morrison family for over 50 years. The house itself was weathered and simple, its white siding faded and roof heavy with icicles. From the outside, it looked as it always had, solid, unmoving, a fixture of the landscape. But that morning, everything inside had changed. Carolyn Morrison, age 52, a former art teacher at the local high school and mother of 3 adult children, was found dead in her home, her body discovered by her youngest son Graham, who had stopped by after she failed to answer the phone. The front door was unlocked. The kitchen light was on, the heat was running, but Carolyn was lying on the floor of the dining room, her body cold, her head resting on the carpet in an unnatural position. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no missing valuables. The medical examiner would later conclude that she had died sometime in the early hours of the morning, likely between 2 and 4 a.m., from blunt force trauma to the head. A single blow. The police were called immediately. Officers arrived and cordoned off the property. Word spread through Westfield quickly. It was the kind of town where tragedies like this didn't feel real. Carolyn was known for her quiet kindness, for baking too many muffins at Christmas and dropping them off at neighbors' doors. She painted watercolors, soft scenes of fields and barns, and sometimes dreamlike portraits of children surrounded by swirling color. Her work had once been shown in a small gallery downtown. She had lived alone since her husband's death a decade earlier. Her children had grown and scattered. Graham still lived in town, working as a mechanic. Her daughter Lola lived in Albany with her wife and taught 2nd grade. Her eldest son Noah was a freelance journalist who had recently returned from overseas. Each of them came home that day, silent and pale, unable to understand what had happened or why. Detectives interviewed the family first. Graham, who had found her, was shaken but cooperative. He had a solid alibi. Security footage from his overnight shift at a local garage confirmed he had left work at 7 a.m. and driven directly to the farmhouse. Lola had last spoken to Carolyn 2 days before. They'd talked about snowstorms and recipes and nothing unusual. Noah had arrived in town only the night before her death, flying in from Minneapolis to spend a few days recovering from a cold and catching up with family. He said he had tried to call her the night before but hadn't reached her. His return flight had been scheduled for the following week. All 3 siblings sat in the living room of their mother's home, while investigators moved quietly through the rooms with cameras and gloves. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow leading to or from the house, at least none that weren't accounted for, no fingerprints that shouldn't have been there. Her wallet and keys were undisturbed. Her old Labrador, Maisie, was unharmed, still asleep in her bed when Graham had arrived. The detectives began looking outward. Could it have been a stranger, a vagrant, a break-in that went wrong? But nothing supported those theories. Then they turned their attention to the details. On the kitchen table sat a letter, handwritten, folded and sealed with a small piece of blue wax. Unusual, certainly, but not impossible. Carolyn had been known to write letters to friends and family in a style more reminiscent of earlier generations. The letter was addressed simply, "To my children." Inside, the writing was neat but slightly hurried. "If something happens to me, please know that I wasn't afraid. I've seen the shape of things in the dark, and I think I understand now. There is nothing left unsaid. I love you all." There was no signature, no explanation, no clue as to what she meant. It could have been written long before her death, detectives reasoned, or it could have been written in her final hours. The coroner found no signs of a struggle. Her body showed no defensive wounds. It was as if someone she knew had come close enough to strike her, and she had never expected it. The weeks that followed were hollow. The investigation yielded little. Rumors circulated, as they always do, and the family grieved quietly. The funeral was held in a small chapel just outside of town. Her paintings were arranged around the altar. The pews were full. People cried openly. Lulla returned to Albany. Graham went back to work, though his eyes looked permanently tired. Noah, however, stayed behind. He rented a room in town, began sorting through his mother's belongings, went through photo albums, boxes of letters, drawers filled with receipts and old recipe cards. And late one night, while sifting through an old cedar chest in the attic, he found something he wasn't supposed to. A second letter. This one was dated January 2nd, 10 days before Carolyn's death. It read, "Noah, if you find this, it means I didn't have the courage to say it out loud. I think someone has been watching the house. At first I thought I was imagining it, but Maisie growls at the window sometimes, and I've heard things at night, footsteps, a creak on the stairs. Your father always said not to be afraid of ghosts, only of the living. I don't know if I should tell the police. I don't know if it's real, but something feels wrong. Something's coming." It was signed "Love, Mom." Noah sat with the letter for over an hour before moving. The attic was cold, and the wind outside had picked up. He felt suddenly very young again, like a boy sitting at the top of the stairs while the grown-ups whispered about things he wasn't meant to hear. He didn't tell his siblings right away. He wasn't sure what to make of it. But he made a copy, brought the original to the detective still assigned to the case. They examined it, compared the handwriting, ran tests. The letter was real, but it raised more questions than it answered. If Carolyn had feared someone was watching her, why hadn't she told her children directly? Why leave a cryptic note hidden away? And if she was being watched, by who? Noah Morrison had always considered himself a skeptic, a realist. As a journalist, he'd covered war zones, famine, political corruption. He had walked through cities where bomb sirens echoed down alleyways, and through towns where people disappeared for speaking too loudly. He had been trained to observe, to document, to find the truth behind the smoke. But here, back in Westfield, this quiet, aging town, where the loudest thing most nights was the rustle of wind against pine, truth felt harder to pin down. He carried his mother's letter folded carefully in his wallet, the creases worn smooth from repeated readings. He read it in the morning before coffee. At night before sleep, he'd memorized the words. Your father always said not to be afraid of ghosts, only of the living. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a riddle. Detective Laura Cates, the lead on his mother's case, had been sympathetic. She was in her mid-40s, thoughtful, methodical. She told Noah they'd combed through everything. Camera footage from nearby businesses, tire tracks in the snow, interviews with neighbors, a forensic sweep of the house, and had come up empty. No forced entry, no sign of a break-in, no strange fingerprints, and no DNA that didn't belong. You mentioned the footprints, Noah said one afternoon in her office, fingers curled around a paper cup of bitter coffee, that there weren't any around the house that didn't belong. But that's impossible. Detective Cates raised an eyebrow. It had just snowed the night before. If someone walked up to the house, wouldn't there be tracks? She nodded slowly. Yes, and there weren't any. Not on the porch, not around the back, no prints at all, except Graham's when he arrived that morning. Then how did they get in? Her silence was answer enough. That night, Noah returned to the farmhouse. It was cold now, the heat turned off to save on utilities. The furniture remained, along with the framed paintings and stacks of mail left unopened on the front table. A light film of dust had settled across the dining room, where his mother had died. Police had removed the carpet and replaced part of the floorboard for evidence testing. The space looked hollow. Upstairs, her bedroom was untouched. Her slippers sat beside the bed. The smell of lavender hung faintly in the air, clinging to the curtains. Noah stood at her vanity, fingers brushing across her makeup tray, a few dried-up tubes of lipstick, an old glass perfume bottle. Her journal was still there too. He hadn't read it until now. The first few entries were mundane, lists of groceries,
reflections on old students, small notes about weather or books she'd read. But mid-December, something shifted. I saw someone again today. Not close, just beyond the trees. They were still. I almost thought it was a trick of the light, but Maisie barked. I waited for them to move, but they didn't. A few days later, another dream about the river. I was standing at the edge, but it wasn't frozen. Something was under the surface watching me. When I woke up, the faucet downstairs was running. I don't remember turning it on. And then, dated January 6th. I think I saw him again, but he's not the same. His face was not right. I'm afraid to say this out loud. I sound crazy, but I don't think it's just dreams anymore. Noah read the words again and again. He's not the same. She didn't say who, but the repetition of the word again suggested it was someone she knew, a man she had seen before, and someone she once trusted. He brought the journal to the police, who took it as potential evidence. But they, too, were running out of leads. The theory of a stranger began to fray. Carolyn's life had been small, focused, close-knit. She had no enemies, no unpaid debts, no criminal history, no ex-lovers or business partners with a grudge. The only people who had access to her home were family, and a few friends who hadn't seen her in weeks. Then came a break, small and strange. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret Lawn, came forward. She lived 2 doors down from Carolyn's property, separated by a stretch of woods. She told police she had seen a man walking along the tree line several times in early January. She thought it might have been Noah, home for a visit. He was tall, like your brother, she told Lila, when Lila visited her one afternoon. But he walked funny, sort of off-kilter, like his legs didn't bend right. I don't know how to explain it. What do you mean, off-kilter? Lila asked gently. I mean wrong, Margaret said, tapping her temple, like someone trying to look like a person, but not quite getting it. Lila relayed this to Noah that evening. He didn't know what to make of it. She's 92, he said. She could have seen anything. But what if she didn't? Lila asked. What if someone really was out there? Someone Mom knew. Graham had stayed mostly quiet throughout the investigation. He didn't read the journals, didn't want to hear theories. He believed it had been random, a burglary gone wrong, a disturbed stranger. He didn't believe in ghosts or stalkers or secrets. But Noah wasn't so sure anymore. He went through the guest book his mother kept in a drawer in the hallway, a small linen-covered ledger she'd used since 1983 to record everyone who visited. Names, dates, short messages, old friends, relatives, neighbors. Most entries were ordinary, but one stood out. It had been written just a week before Carolyn's death. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted, almost rushed. Good to see you again after all this time. Sorry I didn't stay longer. We have much to catch up on. No name, no signature. Noah showed it to Lila. She didn't recognize it either. They called Graham, asked if he knew anyone who had visited their mother that week. He paused. She had coffee with a guy, he said. I don't remember his name. I asked her about it when I came by on New Year's Day. She said he was a friend from before. I figured maybe from her teaching days. Did you see him? No, she just mentioned him. Said he stopped by, and they talked about old times. That was it. A week later, she was dead. Noah brought the guest book entry to Detective Cates. She ran handwriting comparisons, but no match surfaced. No known friends, no family members matched the writing. And then a second discovery, an old photograph, buried deep in a photo album from 1978. It showed Carolyn, 20 years younger, standing beside a tall man in a military uniform. His face was partially obscured by glare, but his posture was unmistakable. On the back in faded pen it read, Carolyn and Eddie, summer before basic. Eddie. Noah had never heard the name before. He asked his aunt, his mother's sister, who still lived 2 towns over. Her face darkened when he said the name. Eddie Vaughan, she said. She dated him before your father. They were engaged, I think. Briefly. But something happened. They broke it off. He joined the army. She married your dad a few years later. Did you ever meet him? Once. He was odd. Polite but cold. Something about his eyes. What happened to him? I don't know. He left. Last I heard he was living out west. Carolyn never mentioned him again. Noah brought the name to the police. They dug into it. Found a military record. Eddie Vaughn had served from 1979 to 1985. Dishonorably discharged after a psychological breakdown while stationed in Nevada. After that, nothing. No addresses. No employment records. No trace of where he'd gone. And no death certificate. Just silence. Noah couldn't shake the feeling. His mother had seen someone from her past. Someone she once trusted. Someone who may not have been the same person anymore. And the words in her journal came back to him. He's not the same. The discovery of Eddie Vaughn's name and past cast a long shadow over the Morrison family, especially for Noah. Suddenly, the quiet domestic tragedy that had seemed so inexplicable took on a deeper, more sinister tone. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Eddie had become, and whether his mother's death was connected to a past she had tried to bury. Noah spent days poring over public records, old newspapers, and military archives. Eddie Vaughn seemed to disappear from every conventional record after his discharge in 1985. But Noah found whispers, small mentions of a man named Edward Vaughn in police blotters from several western states, often tied to minor disturbances, strange behavior, or allegations that never led to charges. The most chilling discovery came from a news article in 1990 out of Reno, Nevada. It described a man matching Eddie's description, who had been detained briefly for stalking a woman who had once been a childhood friend. The man had vanished before any formal charges were filed, leaving the woman terrified. The article ended with a haunting quote from the woman, "He's not the person I knew. Something changed in him after the army." The details fit too well to ignore. Noah felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Could this be the man his mother had feared? Had Eddie Vaughn returned after all these years? And more urgently, had he come back to Westfield with something dark in mind? He shared the findings with Detective Cates during a late-night meeting in the precinct's empty briefing room. She listened with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "If he's still out there," she said, "we need to find him. But after all this time, and no recent sightings, it's like chasing a ghost." Noah knew the feeling all too well. Back at the farmhouse, his siblings were also unraveling in their own ways. Lila, usually calm and grounded, was haunted by nightmares. Graham had become withdrawn, snapping at friends and co-workers. The loss of their mother was raw, but the revelations about Eddie Vaughn stirred old unspoken fears. Noah returned again and again to his mother's journals and letters, desperate for clues. One entry stood out in particular. January 10th. "I saw him at the edge of the woods. It was just a shadow, but it froze my blood. I thought of telling the police, but something stops me. I don't want to believe that history could hurt me now. I want to be safe." That was just 5 days before her death. But what had stopped her from calling for help? Was it fear, shame, or something more complicated? The house itself seemed to carry the weight of those last days. Noah began spending long hours there, walking the creaking floors, searching for any sign that might explain what happened. He retraced his mother's steps, tried to see the world through her eyes. One chilly afternoon, he decided to test the idea of someone entering the house without leaving footprints. It was snowing lightly, and he took careful steps around the perimeter of the home, then out into the woods. If the story from Margaret Lawn, about the man walking oddly, was true, then whoever had come might have used a hidden path or an old logging trail. His search uncovered a narrow, overgrown trail behind the house that led deep into the forest. It was barely wide enough for one person, and the ground beneath was frozen and covered in last week's snow, but there were subtle depressions, almost like footprints, that didn't resemble boots or shoes. They looked unnatural. Noah shivered and stepped back, feeling a creeping unease. The forest suddenly seemed less like a peaceful refuge and more like a place holding secrets, watching. He didn't tell his siblings about the trail yet. Instead, he focused on another lead. A friend of his mother's from her art teaching days. A woman named Ellen Westcott. Ellen had taught alongside Carolyn for years, and was known for her sharp wit and calm demeanor. Noah arranged to meet her at a small cafe downtown. Over black coffee and scones, he asked about Eddie Vaughn. Ellen's expression darkened. That name, I haven't heard it in decades. She paused, then said softly, Carolyn was a good friend. But Eddie, he was trouble. Quiet, intense. There was something wrong even back then. Carolyn tried to protect him, but eventually, she broke off the engagement. It wasn't just the army that changed him. Something happened before he left. Noah leaned forward. Do you know what? Ellen shook her head. No one does. Just stories, whispers of something violent. But Carolyn never talked about it. She buried it deep. That secrecy was what haunted Noah most. The sense that his mother had lived with a fear she couldn't share. A shadow from her past that finally caught up with her. Back at the farmhouse, more strange things began happening. Graham reported hearing footsteps at night, when no one was home, and sometimes the sound of whispers just beyond the windows. Maisie, the old Labrador, would growl at empty corners of the room, her hackles raised and eyes fixed on shadows invisible to the human eye. Lila called one evening, voice trembling. I don't know what to do, Noah. I feel like something is following me, like it's watching us all. Noah tried to be rational. Maybe it's just grief, Lil. We're all on edge. But he wasn't sure himself. Then came the phone calls. Noah's cell rang just after midnight. He answered to silence. No breathing. No background noise. Then just before he hung up, a whisper, a single word, crackled over the line. Remember? He froze. The word echoed in his mind. What was he supposed to remember? The calls kept coming over the next several nights. Always late. Always silence. Always the whisper. Sometimes a name. Sometimes just a breath. Detective Kate suggested tracing the calls. But they came from untraceable payphones or burner phones, always erased before they could be tracked. Noah started keeping a journal of his own, writing down every detail, every phone call, every strange event. He was becoming consumed by the mystery, unable to focus on anything else. Then one afternoon, a package arrived at the farmhouse addressed to Noah. No return address. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. Old, worn, smelling of dust and earth. The cover was unmarked. Inside, the pages were filled with notes, sketches, and cryptic messages. Some were in Carolyn's handwriting, others in a different, harsher scrawl. One page stood out. He watches from the edges. He is no longer Eddie. The man you knew is gone, replaced by something else. Something hungry. Noah's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The notebook spoke of fear, of a man descending into madness, of darkness creeping into the woods around Westfield, and then a name repeated again and again, the Watcher. Noah didn't know what to make of it. Was it a nickname, a warning, a delusion? But it fit with what his mother had felt, with the stranger in the woods, with the man who had once been Eddie Vaughn. Late that night, Noah sat alone in the farmhouse, the notebook open on his lap. Maisie lay at his feet, restless and alert. He heard a soft creak upstairs. His heart pounded. He rose slowly, moving toward the staircase. The house was silent. Then from the window he caught movement. A shadow flickering between the trees. A silhouette, tall, thin, limping. Noah's breath caught. He reached for his phone, but it slipped from his trembling hands. The shadow paused, then vanished. In that moment, he understood something dark and terrible was waiting, and the past was far from over. The weight of the shadow that lingered outside the farmhouse was suffocating. Noah stood by the window long after the silhouette disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Maisie, usually calm and loyal, was now restless, her ears twitching at every sound, her body tense. The silence inside the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Noah's mind was a whirlpool of questions and fears. The presence of the Watcher, whether a ghost of the past or a living nightmare, was undeniable. The truth he had been chasing for weeks was now a tangible force, pressing in on his life, on his family, on the place they once called home without fear. He spent the next morning trying to piece together everything he knew, writing in his journal with a focus that surprised even him. The notebook from the mysterious package was his only link to understanding his mother's final days, and the elusive figure she feared. Each page held fragments of a fractured mind, a desperate attempt to document a nightmare that had spiraled out of control. In one entry, Carolyn had written about the things Eddie saw, though it was unclear if these were hallucinations or something more sinister. He says the forest speaks to him, she had noted. Whispers at night, promises, but the promises come with darkness. Noah felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. Could Eddie Vaughan have been tormented by something beyond human comprehension, or had the traumas of war and life twisted his mind into a labyrinth of paranoia and violence? Later that day, Noah reached out to Detective Cates. She was cautious but willing to help, understanding that the case was more than just a simple investigation now. It was a deeply personal quest for truth. Together they visited the local library and town archives. Old newspapers revealed a history of unexplained disappearances and strange occurrences in the woods surrounding Westfield, dating back decades. Several reports spoke of people hearing voices, seeing shadows, or feeling watched. One chilling headline from 1965 read, "Local woods haunt residents. Fear of the Watcher grows." Noah wondered if this was some kind of local folklore or if it held a kernel of truth. The more he learned, the more he realized his family's story was part of something larger woven into the fabric of the town's collective memory. Back at the farmhouse, the siblings gathered for what felt like the first time since their mother's death. The house was quieter now, but the unease remained. Graham, usually reserved, spoke up. "We can't live like this, waiting for shadows and whispers. We need to confront this, whatever it is." Lila nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "But how? How do you fight something you can't see?" Noah looked at them both, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "We find out who Eddie Vaughan really was. We find out what happened to Mom, and then we face it, together." That night, the house felt different. There was a stillness that was almost peaceful. For a few hours, the family sat together, sharing stories about Carolyn, her laughter, her kindness, her fears. It was a moment of light, in the long shadow of grief. But as the clock edged toward midnight, the silence broke once again. Noah's phone buzzed with a new message, a text with no sender. It read simply, "You're getting closer." His heart raced. The message was both a warning and an invitation. He called Detective Cates immediately, who promised to increase patrols near the farmhouse and check surveillance in the area. But Noah knew this was no ordinary threat. The next few days passed in a haze. Noah became hyper-vigilant, rarely leaving the house, watching the woods with a mixture of dread and determination. Maisie stayed close, her protective instincts heightened. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Noah decided to explore the overgrown trail behind the house again. He needed to understand the path, to follow the footsteps of the past. The forest was cold and still, the snow crunching softly under his boots. The trail wound deeper into the trees, narrowing until it disappeared altogether. He paused, looking around for any sign of the shadow he had seen. That's when he noticed it. A small carved symbol, etched into the bark of a tree, weathered but unmistakable. It was a circle with a dot in the center, surrounded by jagged lines. The same symbol appeared repeatedly in the notebook Carolyn's mysterious messenger had sent. A knot formed in Noah's stomach. This was more than a trail. It was a mark, a message left behind by someone or something. As he moved forward cautiously, he found other signs. Scraps of torn fabric caught on branches, faint footprints in the mud, and deeper still, the faint scent of smoke and something metallic. His pulse quickened. Was he walking into a trap? Or was this the final path leading to answers? Suddenly, he heard a twig snap behind him. Noah spun around, heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches and the shadowed forest floor. He called out softly, "Is someone there?" No answer, just the whisper of wind through the trees. Returning to the farmhouse, Noah felt a mixture of fear and resolve. He wasn't just chasing a ghost anymore, he was stepping into a living nightmare. That night, as he lay awake listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, the whispers came again. This time they were clearer, almost like a voice just out of reach. Remember, remember. Noah closed his eyes, willing the memories to surface, to connect the dots that his mother's life, and now her death, had left scattered. He remembered the stories she told in childhood, the fearful glances she cast toward the forest, the broken promises she whispered in the dark. The past and present were entwined in a way he couldn't yet understand, and the man once known as Eddie Vaughan, now something else entirely, was at the center of it all. As dawn broke, Noah made a decision. He would follow the trail deeper into the woods, confront the unknown, and finally bring peace to his family, or at least uncover the truth that had haunted them for so long. The forest held its breath, waiting, and Noah stepped forward into the shadows.
In the quiet town of Ashland, Oregon, where the dense evergreen forests seemed to cradle the sleepy streets in a green embrace, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. The residents, many artists, writers, and retirees, found comfort in the small community's gentle rhythm, punctuated by the occasional festival or farmer's market. Yet beneath the surface of this tranquil town lay a story that would unravel everything Ashland's citizens thought they knew about safety, trust, and the fragile boundary between neighborliness and danger. It was the late summer of 1988, when 27-year-old Emily Wren disappeared without a trace. Emily was known throughout Ashland not only for her quiet beauty, but also for her dedication to the community. A librarian at the local public library, she had a gentle manner and an infectious smile. She was the sort of person who noticed the small things, a new book arrival, the way a child's face lit up when discovering a story, or the subtle changes in the seasons. The last day anyone saw Emily was a warm August afternoon. She had left work just before 5, planning to meet a friend for dinner at a small cafe near the town square. That evening, her friend waited for over an hour, growing worried when Emily never showed up. Calls to her home phone went unanswered. The following morning, her car remained in the library's parking lot, and Emily was nowhere to be found. The news spread quickly. Ashland, with its low crime rate and tight-knit community, had never before faced a disappearance that touched so many hearts. Search parties formed, scouring the surrounding woods, calling her name into the vast green spaces. Flyers were posted on telephone poles and in shop windows. But days turned into weeks with no sign of Emily. The local police, led by Detective Harold Myers, began a thorough investigation. Interviews with friends, colleagues, and neighbors revealed no clear motive, no enemies, no recent conflicts. Emily's life seemed ordinary, but that ordinariness made her disappearance all the more unsettling. Among the people deeply affected was Matthew, Emily's younger brother, a college student studying psychology. He had always admired his sister's calm strength and kindness. But now, faced with the unknown, he found himself struggling to piece together any clues that might lead to her. He spent hours poring over her belongings, her diaries, her letters, hoping to find something that had been overlooked. One detail, however, stood out: a series of strange phone calls Emily had received in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The calls were never answered, but the number was always unlisted, mysterious. Matthew wondered if these calls had frightened her, or if they were connected to what might have happened. The town's tight social fabric began to fray. Whispers of suspicion crept into conversations. Who could want to harm Emily? Was the danger someone from Ashland, or had she stumbled into something far beyond the peaceful town's borders? Detective Myers kept digging, uncovering small but strange details. A car spotted near the library on the day Emily vanished, a man seen watching the cafe where she was to meet her friend, a fleeting shadow in the background of a photograph taken at a recent community event. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Emily's disappearance was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a darker tale. It would unravel long-held secrets and expose a hidden side of Ashland few had suspected. And for those left behind, especially Matthew, the search for answers was only just beginning, beneath the calm surface of their everyday lives. In the days following Emily Wren's disappearance, the quiet town of Ashland seemed to hold its breath. The sun continued to filter gently through the towering evergreens, the cicadas buzzed with their relentless rhythm, and the late summer air smelled of pine and dry earth. Yet beneath this ordinary veneer, an undercurrent of unease and sorrow ran deep, touching every corner of the community. Detective Harold Myers, a man who had spent decades in law enforcement in southern Oregon, understood the difficulty of such cases. Missing persons investigations were often like threading a needle in the dark, especially when there were no immediate leads. But Emily was different. Her disappearance struck at the heart of Ashland itself. The investigation gained urgency when 3 days after Emily vanished, a local hiker discovered a small worn book beneath a fallen log on the edge of the Ashland Creek Trail, a popular path just outside town. The book was a dog-eared copy of Wuthering Heights, and inside the front cover was a handwritten note, "For Emily, whose heart beats wild like the wind." Detective Myers was intrigued. The handwriting was delicate but hurried, almost like a whisper frozen on paper. Was this a clue, a message from Emily herself, or a coincidence? Matthew Wren, upon hearing about the book, felt a flicker of hope amid the despair. He had known his sister loved classic literature, and often escaped into the worlds of her favorite authors. Perhaps this book, found so close to town, might be a message left behind, or a sign that Emily had been nearby, in the woods, struggling to find a way back. The detective and his team catalogued the book carefully, searching for fingerprints or DNA, but the years in the elements had washed away most physical evidence. What remained, though, was a curious pattern. The book wasn't just left there by chance. Pages were dog-eared in several places, and a loose scrap of paper slipped from between the pages. Matthew unfolded the fragile paper, revealing a hastily scribbled message. "They watch. I'm not safe. The shadows know." The words were chilling, vague yet heavy with fear. In the following days, more strange discoveries came to light. Several residents reported unusual sightings near the forest edges. One man said he saw a figure watching him from the trees near Ashland Creek, a figure that vanished when approached. Another woman mentioned hearing whispers at night outside her window, soft voices that faded when she tried to listen closely. The town's atmosphere darkened. People locked their doors earlier, kept children indoors, and eyed strangers with suspicion. The line between reality and fear blurred. Matthew, meanwhile, continued to sift through his sister's belongings. He found a hidden compartment in Emily's desk, containing journals that revealed a growing anxiety in the months before her disappearance. Emily wrote of feeling followed, of fleeting glimpses of someone standing in the shadows, of the unsettling phone calls she refused to answer, but clearly feared. One entry, dated 2 weeks before she vanished, read, "They say the forest holds memories of pain, of secrets best left buried. But I feel it watching me. I want to run, but where would I go? This town, these trees, they've always been home. But now, home feels like a cage." The weight of her words pressed on Matthew's heart. Emily's fears were no longer just her own, they had become the town's. Detective Myers brought Matthew into the investigation's inner circle. Together they reviewed surveillance footage from the cafe, where Emily was supposed to meet her friend. The grainy video showed Emily arriving, chatting briefly with the friend, then stepping outside alone. After that, the footage grew hazy, but a shadowy figure could be glimpsed near the entrance to the woods across the street. A man, tall and indistinct,
lurking just out of clear view. The detective widened the search to include anyone with a criminal record or suspicious activity around Ashland. Interviews were conducted, tips poured in, but no concrete leads emerged. The mystery thickened. At night, Matthew's dreams were restless. He often found himself walking through the forest, chasing shadows that slipped between the trees. Sometimes he awoke to faint sounds, a whisper of wind, a rustle in the bushes, that reminded him of his sister's last entries. Seeking answers, Matthew turned to the town's oldest residents. Among them was Eleanor, a woman in her late 70s, who had lived in Ashland her entire life. She remembered stories passed down through generations, legends of a watcher who haunted the woods, a spirit or perhaps something darker, linked to disappearances over the decades. Eleanor spoke softly, her voice weaving a tapestry of myth and memory. "The forest holds many secrets," she said. "Long ago, people said the Watcher was a guardian, protecting the land, but over time it turned restless. Some say it's the ghosts of those lost, others say it's something alive, something that feeds on fear. You can't know for sure, but it watches, always watching." Matthew listened, torn between skepticism and a creeping dread. Was Emily's disappearance part of something supernatural, or was the Watcher a human predator, hiding behind local law to mask his crimes? Days turned into weeks, and the investigation reached a standstill. The trail grew cold, public interest faded, replaced by a quiet resignation, but Matthew refused to give up. He retraced Emily's last steps, walked the trails she loved, studied the forest canopy filtering dappled light onto moss-covered stones. He found himself talking aloud to the trees, pleading for a sign. One afternoon, while exploring a remote part of the woods, Matthew stumbled across a small clearing. There, half buried beneath leaves and debris, was a faded piece of fabric, the pattern unmistakably from Emily's jacket. His breath caught in his throat. The discovery reignited hope, but also fear. Emily had been here. What had happened to her? Returning to the police with the evidence, Matthew urged Detective Myers to renew the search in that area. A team was dispatched, combing the forest floor with meticulous care. Days later, they uncovered a shallow grave, concealed beneath years of overgrowth. Inside was a body, partially decomposed but identifiable. It was Emily. The town of Ashland mourned deeply. The gentle librarian, the sister, the friend, was gone. The forest that once seemed a refuge had become a silent witness to tragedy. The medical examiner's report suggested that Emily had been alive for some time after her disappearance, but the exact cause of death was inconclusive. There were no clear signs of trauma, no definitive evidence of foul play. The mystery of what had truly happened to Emily remained. In the aftermath, suspicion turned toward a man named Carl Hayward, a transient with a history of mental illness and minor offenses, who had been seen near the woods that summer. Yet, despite interrogations, no charges were filed. The evidence was circumstantial, and Hayward disappeared from town shortly after. Some in Ashland whispered that the true Watcher was still out there, unseen and unpunished. For Matthew, the loss was a chasm he struggled to fill. The questions that haunted him were not only about who or what had taken Emily, but about the fragile safety of the world they had taken for granted. The forest remained, whispering secrets in the breeze, its shadows shifting with every sunset. And Ashland, forever changed, learned to live with the silence, a silence that spoke volumes. The discovery of Emily's body left Ashland in a fragile state, caught somewhere between grief and disbelief. Her death, wrapped in mystery, brought a quiet sorrow that settled deep into the bones of the town. The forest that had once been a place of solace now seemed like a monument to absence, its stillness a constant reminder of what had been lost. Matthew Wren moved through this grief with a kind of quiet determination, as though the pain itself was a compass guiding him through the darkness. He was no longer simply a brother mourning his sister. He was a man seeking truth, desperate to understand what had happened, and why the answers seemed so elusive. The official investigation into Emily's death continued, but the facts were frustratingly scarce. The medical examiner's report was inconclusive regarding cause of death. No signs of violence, no obvious struggle. Yet Emily had not simply wandered off, she had hidden away in the forest, and somehow her life had slipped away there. Detective Harold Myers remained methodical. He reviewed every piece of evidence, every lead, every statement. The elusive watcher was still a shadow, a ghost that slipped through his grasp. Matthew spent hours at the police station, offering what he could: memories, observations, insights from Emily's journals. He spoke of the phone calls, the feeling of being watched, the strange notes and fragments she left behind, yet none of it painted a clear picture. One evening, as twilight deepened over Ashland, Matthew found himself walking alone to the library where Emily had worked. The building, now closed for the night, stood silent and empty. The familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and a faint trace of lavender, Emily's favorite fragrance, hung in the air. He paused at the entrance, the door locked, and looked up at the windows reflecting the darkening sky. It was here, in this quiet sanctuary, that Emily had spent so many hours. Here, where stories unfolded and lives connected. But now, it was also the place where the thread of her life had been severed. The loss was a silent echo in the halls of the library, a space that seemed to hold memories like fragile dust motes in the air. In the weeks that followed, the community grappled with the shock. Friends and neighbors tried to make sense of the tragedy, clinging to the small comforts of everyday life. Vigils were held, candles lit in Emily's memory, and the library organized a reading of her favorite books. Yet the questions lingered. Who was the watcher? Was it a person, or something more intangible, a force that preyed on fear and isolation? Why had Emily been targeted? Among the residents, suspicion rippled quietly. Some whispered about Carl Hayward, the transient seen near the woods that summer. Others suggested darker theories, that Emily had stumbled onto something she shouldn't have, secrets buried deep within Ashland's history. Matthew, however, found himself drawn to another possibility: the human heart, and its capacity for betrayal cloaked in familiarity. Emily's journals hinted at something subtle but persistent, a fear not just of strangers in the woods, but of someone closer. There were passages filled with unease about a neighbor, a man named Richard Wallace, who lived a few blocks from Emily's house. Richard was well known in Ashland, a quiet, solitary figure who kept to himself but was not considered dangerous. Yet Emily's writings described an encounter that unsettled her deeply. She mentioned a late-night confrontation on her porch, strange comments, and an unsettling presence. Matthew approached Detective Myers with this new lead, handing over the pages from Emily's journal. Detective Myers agreed to look into Richard Wallace. They found that Wallace had no criminal record, no obvious motive, and had been seen as a polite, if somewhat reclusive, member of the community. Yet when questioned, his answers were vague, and he seemed nervous. There was no direct evidence linking Wallace to Emily's disappearance or death, but the discomfort he stirred in those who spoke with him was palpable. Matthew's mind wrestled with conflicting emotions: the desire to find justice for Emily, and the fear of accusing an innocent man. He knew that sometimes danger wore a familiar face, and that evil could hide behind the quietest masks. Meanwhile, the forest held its secrets close. Search teams scoured the area again, looking for any missed clues. They examined tree branches, mossy stones, and the undergrowth, hoping to uncover traces that might explain the final moments of Emily's life. It was during one of these searches that a volunteer, a man named Henry, noticed something peculiar: a small clearing with a roughly carved wooden symbol embedded in a tree trunk. The symbol was worn but distinct, a circle enclosing a pattern resembling a watchful eye. The discovery sent ripples through the investigative team. Was this symbol a mark left by the watcher, a warning, or part of some forgotten ritual? Henry took photographs and notes, which were sent to local historians and folklorists for interpretation. The responses varied. Some suggested the symbol was linked to indigenous protective markings. Others thought it might be a sign used by a secretive group or individual. Matthew found himself drawn deeper into the forest's mysteries, feeling the weight of the past pressing against the present. The trees seemed to whisper in the wind, their voices both soothing and foreboding. At night, he often dreamed of Emily, walking through the woods, her figure flickering like a flame in the shadows. Sometimes she reached out, her eyes pleading for help, for release. One particularly quiet evening, Matthew met with Eleanor, the town elder who had spoken of the Watcher legend. They sat together beneath the ancient firs, the fading light casting long shadows. Eleanor spoke slowly, her voice carrying the cadence of years lived close to the land. "The forest remembers," she said. "It keeps the stories of those who walked before, and sometimes those who should not be forgotten. The Watcher is not just a man, or a ghost, but the weight of those stories, pain, loss, and a hunger for justice that has gone unmet." Matthew listened, feeling a strange comfort in her words. Could the Watcher be a symbol, a manifestation of Ashland's collective grief and fear? Or was there still a man, hidden in plain sight, whose presence haunted the woods and their memories? As the days passed, the investigation stretched thin, the threads weaving tighter but leading nowhere. The townspeople moved cautiously, some avoiding the woods altogether, others finding solace in routine. Matthew dedicated himself to organizing community meetings, creating support groups for families affected by loss, and encouraging openness about fear and grief. It was clear to him that while the answers might never come fully, healing was still possible. One afternoon, as autumn's chill began to creep into the air, Matthew received an unexpected phone call. The voice was unfamiliar, low and hesitant. "I know what happened to Emily," the caller whispered. The line went dead before Matthew could respond. The call sent a tremor of both hope and dread through him. Someone out there held the truth, but would they speak again? Would they bring light to the shadows, or plunge the town further into darkness? The search for answers continued, a slow winding path through memory, fear and the echoes of a life stolen too soon. The forest waited quietly, watching. The night that Matthew received the mysterious call, the wind outside carried an unusual stillness, as though the forest itself held its breath. He sat alone in his small living room, the phone in his hand feeling heavier than before. The voice had been faint, wavering, but the words had cut through the fog of uncertainty like a shard of ice. "I know what happened to Emily." He had replayed the phrase in his mind dozens of times since. Who had called? What did they know? And why had they hung up so suddenly? For days Matthew felt caught between hope and frustration, a delicate balance that seemed to shift with every passing hour. He wondered whether the caller was someone close to Emily, a friend or neighbor, or perhaps someone who had watched from the shadows all along. Matthew tried to follow every lead, speaking again with Detective Myers, and urging the police to keep open lines for any further contact. But no new calls came, no messages left. The silence that followed was a heavy thing. In the meantime, life in Ashland moved slowly forward. The town clung to its routines, the rhythm of school, work and quiet evenings, resisting the disruption of grief. Yet the scars remained visible. The library, once a vibrant hub of community, seemed subdued, as though the walls themselves mourned. Visitors spoke in hushed tones, and the forests were walked with cautious steps. Emily's family organized a small memorial in the clearing, where she had been found. Friends left flowers, candles and notes, a fragile gesture of remembrance. At the memorial, Matthew stood beside his mother and father, the weight of loss settling deep within them all. He spoke softly. Emily was more than just a victim. She was a bright light, a voice for kindness, and someone who saw the world with clarity and courage. The gathering dispersed quietly, but the grief lingered. Matthew found himself increasingly drawn back to Emily's journals, searching for meaning in her words. He read passages filled with hope, with dreams of leaving Ashland and creating a life far from the shadows that had grown around her. She wrote of small acts of rebellion, late-night walks through the woods, secret meetings with friends, moments of laughter and freedom. But woven through these bright threads was the persistent fear, the sense that someone was watching, waiting. One entry stood out, penned just days before her disappearance. "There is a man who watches from the edge of the trees. I don't know his name, but I feel his eyes on me. I try to ignore it, but it's like a weight pressing down. I'm not sure if he means to hurt me, or if he's just lonely like I am." This uncertainty haunted Matthew, the possibility that Emily's fear was rooted in something not easily understood, a presence that was as much a part of the forest as the wind and leaves, left an ache in his heart. The investigation into Richard Wallace eventually stalled. Without evidence, the police could not pursue charges. Wallace himself disappeared from Ashland, moving away quietly in the months after Emily's death. His departure left an unspoken question hanging in the air. Had he been innocent all along, or had the shadows simply shifted? Meanwhile, Henry's discovery of the carved symbol on the tree remained unexplained. Experts offered differing interpretations, but none could link it definitively to the case. In Ashland, some residents began to speak openly about the Watcher as a kind of legend, a ghost story born from collective fear and sorrow. The symbol became a part of local lore, a reminder of the unknown, and the mysteries that live just beyond the edge of understanding. Matthew, though exhausted by the years of searching, found a strange solace in this. He realized that some stories, no matter how deeply we yearn for closure, remain open-ended. The absence of answers, while painful, was a testament to the complexity of human life, its unpredictability, its shadows. One late autumn afternoon, Matthew returned to the forest alone. The trees stood tall and silent, their leaves drifting slowly to the ground in a quiet snowfall of amber and gold. He walked to the clearing, where Emily's body had been found, now marked with a small wooden cross and fresh flowers. As he stood there, the breeze stirred the branches above, carrying the scent of earth and pine. He whispered a goodbye, a hope for peace that stretched beyond the boundaries of grief. In that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with him, ancient, watchful, alive. The mystery of Emily's death remained, but so did her memory, held gently in the hearts of those who loved her. The Watcher was a shadow that might never fully be understood, a reminder of the fragility of life and the unseen threads that bind us all. As night fell, Matthew walked slowly back toward the edge of the trees, the soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet, the only sound in the stillness. The town of Ashland would never be quite the same, touched forever by loss and the silent question of what lies beyond the known. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the Watcher remained, unseen, unfathomable, a shadow among shadows.
The small town of Willow Creek sat nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, a place where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were few. It was the kind of town that held a steady, predictable rhythm, quiet mornings, gentle afternoons, and evenings filled with the soft glow of porch lights. But beneath this calm exterior, a quiet tension had begun to stir, one that no one saw coming until it was too late. It was late October 1992, when the first signs appeared. Sarah Mitchell, a well-liked high school English teacher in her early 30s, was known for her gentle nature and quiet strength. She lived in a modest house on Elm Street, just a short walk from the center of town. Her life was marked by simplicity, a love for classic novels, long walks with her golden retriever, and an earnest devotion to her students. Yet, in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Sarah had grown increasingly withdrawn. Friends noticed subtle changes. She stopped attending book club meetings, cancelled plans without explanation, and her once bright smile became rare. No one suspected the storm that was quietly gathering in the shadows. One chilly evening, as the leaves turned brittle and the wind carried whispers of winter, Sarah vanished. She left behind a dinner plate half cleared, a cup of tea still steaming on the kitchen table, and an unanswered phone call from her mother. The news of her disappearance spread through Willow Creek like a slow, creeping fog. At first there was disbelief. Sarah was responsible, steady, and loved by many. But as hours turned to days with no sign of her, fear settled in. The town rallied. Volunteers scoured the nearby woods, officers knocked on every door, and search parties called out her name into the cold night air. Yet, Sarah was nowhere to be found. The police investigation began quickly, led by Detective Lisa Harper, a seasoned investigator known for her thoroughness and compassion. Lisa had grown up near Willow Creek and knew the town well, its people, its history, and its hidden corners. Her first step was to understand Sarah's life in detail, speaking with family, friends, and colleagues. Sarah's mother described her daughter as kind and meticulous, never one to disappear without notice. Her closest friend, Jenna, recalled the subtle shifts in Sarah's mood, the vague unease she'd expressed in recent weeks. But there was little else to go on. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The media began to circle, bringing an unfamiliar glare to the town's quiet streets. Headlines questioned whether Sarah had run away, if she was a victim of foul play, or something more complex. In the midst of this, Detective Harper found a clue: Sarah's journal left behind on a shelf in her bedroom. The worn leather-bound book contained carefully written entries, capturing moments of everyday life alongside more cryptic passages that hinted at a growing fear. One entry read, "I feel like I'm being watched. It's hard to explain, but sometimes when I walk home after dark, I catch a glimpse of someone just out of sight. I tell myself it's my imagination, but the feeling lingers." The journal offered no names, no clear threats, only fragments of a fear Sarah could not fully articulate. It was the beginning of a deeper mystery. Detective Harper's team focused on possible suspects, anyone who might have had reason to harm Sarah or drive her away. They looked into recent break-ins, reports of suspicious figures in the area, and even questioned Sarah's colleagues and acquaintances. Among the leads was Mark Evans, a local handyman with a temper and a history of run-ins with the law. He had been seen near Sarah's house shortly before her disappearance. But without solid evidence, he remained only a person of interest. In the background, the town whispered theories. Some whispered that Sarah had discovered something she shouldn't have. Others suggested a secret romance gone wrong. None of these theories could be confirmed. Weeks passed. The cold deepened. Then one morning, a call came from a hiker in the nearby state forest. She had stumbled upon a small clearing, where a backpack was partially buried beneath fallen leaves. Inside, police found a scarf belonging to Sarah, along with a notebook, its pages damp but legible. The notebook was unlike the journal left behind at home. It contained strange symbols, sketches of eyes and trees, and cryptic phrases that seemed to circle around a hidden meaning. Detective Harper brought in experts on local folklore and symbols, hoping to find a connection. The experts spoke cautiously, suggesting the symbols might relate to old folk beliefs about protection and vigilance, signs meant to warn or ward off unseen dangers. The discovery deepened the mystery. Was Sarah involved with something beyond the ordinary? Had she stumbled into an ancient secret? Amidst these questions, the investigation stalled. The trail went cold again, and the town's hope dimmed. Friends and family gathered in quiet support, clinging to memories of the woman they loved, and searching for meaning in the silence she left behind. Sarah's disappearance was more than a mystery. It was a wound in the heart of Willow Creek, a haunting that would linger long after the last searchlight faded. As autumn gave way to winter, the woods held their secrets tightly, the shadows growing longer with each passing day. The discovery of Sarah's belongings in the forest stirred a mixture of hope and unease across Willow Creek. For some, it was a sign she might still be alive, that the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. For others, it was a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond the familiar edges of their town. Detective Lisa Harper spent long hours poring over the notebook recovered with Sarah's scarf. The symbols within were intricate, looping lines and shapes that seemed almost ritualistic, like fragments of a language lost to time. Some resembled eyes, others vaguely echoed the silhouettes of trees, animals, or stars. The phrases she could make out were written in a hurried hand, the ink faded in places by moisture and time. One passage stood out: "The watcher in the leaves sees the truth beneath the soil. Guard the flame. Keep the circle whole." Lisa read it again and again, searching for clarity. She consulted a local historian, Dr. Elaine Frost, who had spent decades studying Appalachian folklore and the region's indigenous traditions. Dr. Frost explained that many such symbols were used in folk magic, meant to protect against evil spirits, or to signal warnings. The watcher might refer to a guardian spirit, or conversely, a malevolent presence. "There's an ambiguity," Dr. Frost said carefully. "These signs could be a plea for safety, or an invocation of power. It depends on who drew them and why." This possibility opened a new direction in the investigation. Had Sarah been exploring these old beliefs? Was she attempting to protect herself from something she feared? Lisa found herself walking the edges of the forest, with a renewed sense of purpose. She noticed the landscape differently now. The thick underbrush, the towering oaks and maples, the patches of moss clinging to the rocks. At times she imagined what Sarah must have felt in those woods, perhaps a mix of fascination and fear, a desperate need to understand forces she couldn't see. But the forest held its secrets close, silent beneath the whispering canopy. Meanwhile in town, the atmosphere grew heavier. People started locking their doors more carefully, speaking in hushed tones about shadows seen at dusk or strange sounds carried on the wind. Jenna, Sarah's closest friend, found herself haunted by the memory of their last conversation. It had been late September when Sarah called Jenna in a trembling voice. "I don't know if I'm imagining things, but something isn't right," she had said. "I feel watched. And last week I found these strange markings near my house. I thought it was just kids playing a prank, but I don't know." Jenna had tried to reassure her, but the unease in Sarah's voice was unmistakable. Now Jenna wondered if those markings had been a clue, a silent cry for help. Jenna also remembered Sarah's growing obsession with a local legend she'd mentioned often, the tale of the Green Man, a figure said to watch over the forest, appearing in times of turmoil or danger. Some saw the Green Man as a protector, others as a warning of darker things hidden beneath the trees. Sarah had spoken of trying to find the place where the Green Man was said to dwell, a clearing deep in the woods where the trees formed a natural circle. Could that have been where she went in her final days? Detective Harper's team expanded their search to include that part of the forest, organizing a grid to comb through every inch of the terrain. Despite their efforts, no trace of Sarah was found beyond the backpack and scarf already recovered. Months slipped by. The cold grip of winter settled over Willow Creek, coating the ground in frost and snow. The search for Sarah slowed as the weather made the woods treacherous and the leads fewer. Inside her modest home, Sarah's mother kept her daughter's room untouched. The faded wallpaper, the neatly stacked books on the shelves, and the framed photograph of Sarah smiling beneath a bright autumn sky formed a silent shrine. Each day was marked by quiet hope and profound sorrow. In the community, a vigil was held on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. Lanterns were lit and set adrift along the creek, their soft glow reflecting like tiny stars on the water's surface. Neighbors gathered, sharing memories and offering prayers for a safe return, or at the very least peace. Detective Harper spoke softly to the crowd, her voice steady but filled with empathy. "We will not forget Sarah," she said. "We will continue to search for answers, for truth and for the justice she deserves." Despite the official investigations and the public attention, the mystery of Sarah's disappearance remained unsolved. Speculation continued to swirl. Some believed Sarah had been taken by a stranger, others thought she might have wandered into the forest and become lost or injured. A few whispered darker theories about secret rituals or hidden dangers lurking in the woods. But the facts were scarce, and the line between fact and fear blurred with each retelling. For Lisa, the case became more than a job. It was a reminder of the fragility of safety, of how easily the ordinary could be shattered. She often found herself thinking of Sarah, imagining the teacher who had once walked these streets, whose life had been filled with quiet dreams and simple joys. There were moments when Lisa felt as if the answers were just out of reach, shadows flickering at the edge of understanding, like the shifting light through the autumn leaves. Then late one evening, months after the initial disappearance, Lisa received an anonymous letter. It was brief, typed on plain paper, and unsigned. The letter read, "Look deeper where the forest meets the forgotten. She was never far. The truth waits beneath the old stone." The phrase sent a chill through Lisa's bones. Where the forest meets the forgotten, what could it mean? Was it a location, a clue hidden in plain sight? The mention of an old stone suggested something physical, a marker or monument perhaps long overlooked. Lisa consulted with Dr. Frost again, who recalled that in the outskirts of Willow Creek, there was a crumbling stone wall built by settlers over a century ago. The wall was known locally as the Forgotten Fence, once marking a boundary, now swallowed by brambles and thyme. Could this be the place referenced in the letter? Determined to follow every possible lead, Lisa organized a small team to investigate the area. The Forgotten Fence lay at the border where the forest gave way to farmland, the stones moss-covered and uneven. As they searched the area, the officers found small carvings on some stones,
patterns similar to those in Sarah's notebook. Near the base of one large boulder, half covered in ivy, they uncovered a shallow pit. Inside the pit lay a tattered scarf, not Sarah's, but something worn and old, as if placed there long ago. Nearby, faint footprints suggested recent activity. The discovery sent ripples through the investigation. It was clear someone had been there, and the carvings hinted at a secret world Sarah might have been trying to uncover. Lisa felt a mixture of frustration and hope. The case was now tied to a place of memory and mystery, blending the past and present in a way that complicated every theory. In the weeks that followed, the police intensified surveillance around the forgotten fence. Officers spoke with local farmers, hunters and residents, seeking anyone who might know more, but the community was tight-lipped. Fear and superstition held sway, as though mentioning certain things aloud would summon consequences no one wanted to face. At home, Sarah's family felt the slow burn of grief transform into a steady flame of determination. They spoke often with Detective Harper, sharing stories, photographs and hopes. Her father, a quiet man of few words, confided to Lisa one afternoon, Sarah was searching for something, not just answers, but a way to make sense of the world. If anyone could find it, it was her. The words lingered with Lisa, a reminder of the humanity at the heart of the investigation. She thought of Sarah's journal, the cryptic notebook, and the mysterious symbols, fragments of a story never fully told. Despite the passage of time, the case was far from closed. The forest around Willow Creek remained an ever-shifting presence, beautiful and unforgiving, its shadows deepening as the seasons turned. And somewhere, hidden beneath the surface of stones and leaves, the truth awaited discovery. Winter deepened its hold on Willow Creek, cloaking the small town in a quiet stillness that seemed to press upon its residents like a weight. Snow fell gently through the gray skies, muffling sounds and softening edges, transforming familiar landscapes into dreamlike scenes of white. The forest around town lay dormant, its bare branches reaching upward like skeletal fingers against the cold, pale light. In this hush, the investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance took on an almost spectral quality, a search for shadows and whispers amid the frozen silence. Detective Lisa Harper returned frequently to the site known as the Forgotten Fence. Despite the cold, she felt drawn there, compelled by the mystery carved into the mossy stones and the chilling messages left behind. The carved symbols, eyes watching, circles enclosing shapes, lines that seemed to spiral endlessly, were like an echo of something lost, a language Sarah had tried to speak before she vanished. Lisa's team continued their canvassing of the area, speaking to farmers and locals again and again, but the landscape of human memory was as barren as the winter trees. People clammed up when pressed too hard, offering polite but evasive answers. It was as though the land itself held a pact of silence. Some mentioned stories whispered in the town long ago, tales of disappearances, warnings passed down through generations, but no one was willing to admit knowledge of anything recent or concrete. One evening, after a day spent combing through old records at the county archive, Lisa found herself alone in the quiet police station, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the worn wood. Among the yellowing papers and faded photographs, she uncovered a report from nearly 50 years prior, an unsolved case that bore a strange resemblance to Sarah's disappearance. The report detailed the vanishing of a young woman named Evelyn Carter, who had lived on the outskirts of Willow Creek in 1975. Evelyn had been last seen near the same forest, where she was reportedly researching local legends and folk rituals for a school project. Like Sarah, she had left behind mysterious notes and sketches filled with arcane symbols and cryptic phrases. Her disappearance had haunted the community then, and no trace of her was ever found. Lisa felt a chill creep through her spine. The parallels were unsettling. Two young women, decades apart, both drawn to the secrets of the forest, both swallowed by silence. Could the forest itself be a trap, a place where the past and present collided in tragic ways? The realization deepened the weight of the case, reminding Lisa that what she was chasing was not just the story of one missing girl, but possibly a thread woven into the fabric of Willow Creek's history. Back in town, Sarah's family tried to hold on to hope, despite the silence stretching between them like a canyon. Her mother, Elaine Mitchell, had taken to volunteering at the local library, organizing community search efforts and supporting families facing similar pain. Her quiet resilience became a beacon for others, a testament to love's endurance amid despair. Sarah's father, Michael, struggled differently. The loss felt like a hollowing out, a slow erosion of the future he had imagined for his daughter. He spent long nights staring at photographs, tracing memories like fragile lifelines. He confided once to Lisa, "It's the waiting that breaks you, the not knowing, the endless empty space." Jenna, Sarah's best friend, moved away from Willow Creek a few months after the disappearance. The grief was too heavy, the reminders too sharp. Before leaving, she left a small notebook at the police station, a journal she had kept since Sarah vanished. It was filled with memories, reflections and fragments of their last conversations. Reading Jenna's words, Lisa sensed the threads of a relationship marked by warmth and worry, the small details of everyday life now stained with loss. In one entry, Jenna wrote, "Sarah wasn't just searching for answers in the woods. She was searching for herself, trying to understand who she was beneath the surface. I wish I had known how deep her fear ran, how far she was willing to go to find peace." This intimate glimpse into Sarah's inner world humanized the case beyond headlines and rumors. Meanwhile, in the forest, the search took an unexpected turn. A local hunter, Tom Reynolds, reported seeing a figure moving near the forgotten fence late one evening. Tom was an experienced outdoorsman, respected for his keen eyes and knowledge of the terrain. "I could tell it was a woman, walking slowly, like she was lost or looking for something," he told Lisa. "But when I tried to call out, she vanished behind the trees, like she disappeared into thin air." The sighting reignited a spark of hope and fear. If Sarah, or someone connected to her, was still in the woods, what had kept her hidden all this time? Lisa and her team increased patrols, installing cameras and coordinating with volunteer search groups. The forest, however, remained an enigma, concealing its secrets beneath layers of cold earth and snow. The psychological toll of the case began to weigh heavily on Lisa. She often found herself restless at night, haunted by images of Sarah wandering those dark woods, vulnerable and afraid. She thought about the power of belief, the way legends and fears intertwined, shaping how people perceived the unknown. Was Sarah a victim of something human, or something beyond understanding? In moments of quiet reflection, Lisa returned to the notebook's cryptic words, wondering if they held the key to unlocking the mystery. The phrase "guard the flame, keep the circle whole" echoed in her mind. Had Sarah been trying to protect herself or someone else? Was the circle a literal place, or a metaphor for a fragile balance disturbed by unseen forces? The case blurred the lines between reality and myth, inviting more questions than answers. As winter began to thaw into early spring, a break came that would shift the investigation's course. A hiker discovered a small wooden box buried beneath a fallen tree near the forgotten fence. Inside were personal items, a silver locket engraved with Sarah's initials, a folded piece of paper with hastily scrawled writing, and a small hand-carved figurine, resembling the Green Man from local legend. The note was brief: "I am close. Fear has many faces. Trust the woods." The discovery was both a message and a plea. For Lisa, it was proof that Sarah was still present in some way, not merely a missing person frozen in time, but a living story unfolding in fragments. It deepened the haunting reality of the case, a narrative woven with threads of fear, hope, and the inscrutable power of the natural world. The community responded with cautious optimism. Some felt the note was a sign that Sarah might still be alive. Others worried it was a final gesture, a farewell etched in cryptic symbols. Through it all, the forest continued to stand watch, a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. Lisa realized that the case was no longer about finding a single truth, but about understanding the many truths that coexisted in the shadows. The fears and hopes of a small town, the fragile boundaries between legend and reality, and the enduring impact of one young woman's search for meaning. In the months that followed, the investigation remained active, but the pace slowed under the weight of uncertainty. The forest grew green again, leaves returning to branches, birdsong filling the air, yet the mystery remained a quiet ache beneath the surface of Willow Creek's peaceful facade. And somewhere, beneath the canopy, the truth waited, as elusive as the shifting light through the leaves. As spring deepened its hold on Willow Creek, the days lengthened, and the once stark and silent forest began to hum with renewed life. The sharp bite of winter gave way to the soft fragrance of damp earth and budding leaves. Yet beneath this veneer of renewal, the story of Sarah Mitchell lingered like a whisper carried on the wind, elusive, unresolved, but undeniably present. Detective Lisa Harper sat at her desk one cool April morning, the wooden surface cluttered with files, photographs, and Sarah's notebook carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The latest discoveries, the wooden box with the locket and the note, had reopened wounds, but also stirred a faint glimmer of hope. It was a hope tempered by years of silence and disappointment, but hope nonetheless. The community, too, remained suspended between fear and longing. For many in Willow Creek, Sarah was no longer simply a missing person. She had become a symbol, a living absence that shaped the town's rhythms and conversations. In quiet moments, townsfolk would pause by the edge of the forest, their gazes drifting toward the tangled trees where she had last been seen. They wondered what secrets lay hidden beneath the moss and roots, and if the forest itself held the answers. Sarah's mother, Elaine, was among those who felt the weight of the unknown most deeply. She had transformed her grief into quiet activism, connecting with families of other missing persons across the state. Through these connections, she found fragments of solace, a shared understanding of loss and a thin thread of hope that refused to break. On a particularly clear morning, Elaine walked the edge of the forest with Lisa, their breaths misting in the cool air. The trees towered above them, their branches interlacing like fingers, casting dappled shadows on the soft ground. Elaine carried Sarah's silver locket in her palm, the small object warm and heavy with memory. "I don't know if I'll ever find answers," Elaine said softly, her voice steady but fragile, "but walking here, it feels like I'm closer to her somehow." Lisa nodded. "The forest holds more than we understand. It's a place of life and loss, stories and silence." They moved slowly, absorbing the stillness, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. The forest, though vast and mysterious, was no longer a place of fear but a fragile sanctuary, a place where the past and present met in quiet conversation. That afternoon, Lisa met with a local historian, Dr. Martin Reeves, who had spent decades studying Willow Creek's folklore and hidden histories. Over cups of strong coffee in the small library, Martin shared insights that shed new light on Sarah's disappearance. "The forest around here," Martin explained, "has long been considered a threshold, a boundary between the known world and something older, something more enigmatic. For generations, people have spoken of the Green Man, a figure embodying nature's power, protection, and mystery. The carvings Sarah found, and the figurine in the box suggest she was drawn into this web of myth and meaning." Lisa listened intently, intrigued by how folklore and fact intertwined. "Do you think Sarah believed in these legends?" she asked. Martin smiled gently. Whether she believed or not, she was seeking connection. People often turn to stories to make sense of their lives, especially when faced with uncertainty or pain. Sarah's notes hint at a quest, not just for answers about the forest, but for understanding herself and her place in the world. The conversation stayed with Lisa as she walked home, the spring breeze carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers. She realized that this case was as much about human longing as it was about mystery, a search for meaning in the face of disappearance. In the weeks that followed, new leads emerged slowly. A hiker reported hearing faint voices near the forgotten fence at dusk, voices that seemed to float on the wind. Another local found a scrap of fabric caught on a bramble, fabric that matched a jacket Sarah was known to wear. These fragments stirred the investigation, but offered no definitive answers. The police expanded their efforts, coordinating with state authorities and enlisting volunteers from neighboring towns. Together they scoured the forest, methodically searching every hidden hollow and tangled thicket. Yet the forest's secrets remained just out of reach. One afternoon, Lisa received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Daniel Shaw, a recluse, who lived deep in the woods. He claimed to have information about Sarah, but was reluctant to meet in person. Instead, he agreed to speak on the phone. When Lisa called him, his voice was low and hesitant. "I saw her," he said simply. "That girl who went missing. I saw her near the old cabin, last winter." Lisa's heart quickened. "The old cabin? Where is that?" "Not far from the forgotten fence," Daniel replied. "I don't want to get involved more than this. Just know she's alive, but she's scared. She's hiding." The conversation left Lisa both hopeful and troubled. Who was this man? Could Sarah really be alive after so many months? And if so, what had driven her into isolation? Determined to follow this lead, Lisa organized a small team to investigate the area Daniel described. They moved cautiously through the thickening underbrush, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. After several hours, they found the cabin, an old weather-beaten structure nearly swallowed by vines and shadow. Inside, dust motes floated in shafts of light through cracked windows. The air smelled of damp wood and neglect. Signs of recent use were subtle but present: a boot print in the dirt floor, scraps of cloth folded neatly on a rough-hewn table. Lisa's pulse quickened with each step. Here was a space that had sheltered someone, perhaps Sarah, in the silence of the forest. Despite the careful search, no one was found inside. But on a makeshift altar of stones in the corner lay more carvings and a bundle of wild flowers, faded but carefully arranged. The discovery deepened the enigma. It spoke of presence and absence, of someone living on the edge of the world, caught between hope and fear. Back in town, the news spread quietly. The community responded with a mixture of relief and apprehension. For some, the cabin was proof that Sarah had survived against all odds. For others, it was a haunting reminder of her vulnerability. Lisa continued to visit the site over the coming weeks, leaving notes and small offerings of food. She felt a connection growing, not just to the missing girl but to the forest itself, a place that held her story in its silent grasp. On a cool evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world, Lisa stood at the edge of the forgotten fence, gazing out at the darkening woods. The carvings on the stones seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, as if alive with secrets. She thought of Sarah, her courage, her search, and the quiet strength that had drawn her into the heart of the mystery. The case remained open, the path forward uncertain, but Lisa knew that the journey itself, the search for understanding and connection, was a vital part of the story. In the quiet aftermath, the people of Willow Creek began to reclaim their sense of place, weaving Sarah's memory into the fabric of their lives. The forest, no longer just a place of fear, became a living witness to resilience and hope.
The haunting presence of the missing girl lingered, not as a shadow to be feared, but as a reminder of the fragile beauty and complexity of human existence. And as the seasons turned once more, the story of Sarah Mitchell remained, a slow, unfolding mystery carried on the whisper of the wind, inviting those who listened to hold space for questions without easy answers, for loss without closure, and for the enduring strength of hope. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, don't forget to tune in to more of our content on our page, and also like this video and subscribe to our channel. Good night.